In the Valley of Mexico, in the year 1519, smoke drifted slowly above the calm expanse of Lake Texcoco. Rising from the horizon, an island city, orderly, immense, alive, shimmered in the mid-morning light. Its name was Tenochtitlan. In canals, canoes glided silently beneath stone causeways and ornate aqueducts. Beneath temple stairs, priests burned copal to the gods. Merchants stacked cacao, beans, obsidian, and fine cotton by the thousands. This was not a wilderness awaiting civilization. It was civilization. Its streets bustled with record keepers, soldiers, tribute collectors, and astronomer priests whose calendars rivaled those of Europe or Egypt. Tenochtitlan had risen in barely 2 centuries from nomadic obscurity to imperial grandeur, the capital of the Aztec Triple Alliance, ruler of 5 to 6 million people across 80,000 square miles. Yet within 2 years of Spanish arrival, it would lie in ruins. The Aztecs mattered not only for their empire's scale or sudden collapse, but because they exemplified the last, complex, and independently evolved urban civilization of the Americas. Their story reveals how environment, cosmology, violence, and memory shaped a society both deeply human and alien to the modern gaze. Continue as we examine how lake, lineage, and language built Mesoamerica's final empire. The Basin of Mexico is a high-altitude amphitheater. Ringed by volcanoes and dry sierras, its flat interior cradled a shallow lake system that once stretched across 1,500 square kilometers. Around 2000 BCE, as climate shifted toward greater aridity, small horticultural communities began adapting to the lacustrine environment. They cultivated maize, beans, squash, and chili in seasonal patterns, experimenting with artificial mounds and primitive canals. The earliest known ceremonial center, Tlapacoya, rises from this period, its refuse layers yielding obsidian tools, clay figurines, and the burned remains of offerings. Here, sedentism took root not only in habit, but in worldview. Ritual and surplus began to anchor power. By 1200 BCE, larger settlements like Cuicuilco emerged on the southern lake's rim. Stratigraphic data from this site reveal concentric basalt platforms and a circular pyramid, among the oldest of its kind in Mesoamerica. Radiocarbon analysis places major construction phases around 800 BCE, signaling an early urban hierarchy tied to water control and fertility rites. Obsidian cores from distant Pachuca and the Valley of Toluca suggest regional exchange networks already forming. Cuicuilco, in its prime, was a theocratic center of perhaps 20,000 people, but it would not endure. Around 100 CE, the Zittel volcano erupted just west of Cuicuilco. A pyroclastic flow buried much of the city in basaltic lava, displacing its population northward. Many scholars trace this demographic shock directly to the meteoric rise of Teotihuacan, a planned city that, within centuries, became the largest in the hemisphere. Built nearly 40 kilometers northeast of modern-day Mexico City, Teotihuacan was aligned with astronomical precision. Its central avenue of the dead, extending 5 kilometers in geometric regularity. Excavations at the Pyramid of the Sun indicate construction began before 100 CE, using over 1.2 million cubic meters of material. The city's grid, water channels, and apartment compounds point to a centralized authority capable of coordinating labor at imperial scale. At its peak between 300 and 550 CE, Teotihuacan housed over 100,000 people. Its influence radiated across Mesoamerica as far as the Maya lowlands, where Teotihuacano-style imagery appears at Tikal and Caminaljuyu. Ceramic analysis shows that artisans in Oaxaca and the Gulf Coast adopted its motifs and pigments. Yet despite its reach, the city remains enigmatic. Its rulers left no known inscriptions, no kings' names carved in stone. Instead, Teotihuacan's ideology expressed itself in architecture and cosmograms. The Temple of the Feathered Serpent, excavated in the 1980s, revealed over 200 sacrificial burials, warriors bound and interred in radial symmetry beneath stone effigies. Here, power communicated through spectacle and sacred violence. This state apparatus, anonymous, bureaucratic, ideologically coherent, collapsed between 550 and 650 CE. Evidence from multiple compounds reveals fire damage, looted caches, and elite residential abandonment. Scholars debate whether this was an external invasion or internal revolt. What is clear is that Teotihuacan's demise left a vacuum. In its wake rose a mosaic of regional powers, Xochicalco, Cacaxtla, and particularly the Toltecs, whose capital at Tula thrived around 951,150 CE. The Toltecs reintroduced monumental sculpture and militarized iconography. Their distinctive colonnaded halls and warrior reliefs reveal a hybrid aesthetic blending Teotihuacan symmetry with Mayan narrative dynamism. Stone Chak-Mool altars and effigy braziers suggest a cult of fire and sacrifice, possibly inherited through priestly lineages. Aztec chronicles, though written post-conquest, refer to the Toltecs as bearers of wisdom, craft, and kingship. The term Toltecatl came to signify civilized arts, even as the historical Toltecs faded. The Mexica would later claim descent from this lineage, though the evidence is symbolic, not genealogical. What they inherited with certainty were ruins, the bones of cities, fractured temples, half-buried obsidian blades. These remnants shaped memory. They gave the Mexica a mirror and a warning that power is possible, but impermanence inevitable. The fall of Teotihuacan and Tula did not erase urban knowledge, it dispersed it. Across the Valley of Mexico, smaller city-states, Altepetl preserved calendrical rites, tribute protocols, and hydrological know-how. Excavations at Azcapotzalco and Texcoco show continuity in canal construction, terrace farming, and civic layout. Political units grew modestly, but maintained order through kinship, patron deity cults, and market networks. Trade in obsidian, salt, maguey fiber, and cacao continued through overland and lake transport routes. This web of semi-independent cities formed the ecological and ideological bedrock into which the Mexica would insert themselves by the 13th century. In the highland ecology of central Mexico, environmental adaptation was never static. Communities developed in response to cyclical droughts, volcanic activity, and lacustrine fluctuations. These stresses shaped the built world as much as theology or trade. In areas surrounding the lake system, terrace agriculture became essential. Soil cores taken near Lake Xoltocan show alternating layers of alluvial deposition and anthropogenic modification, pointing to periods of engineered land stabilization dating back to 800 BCE. Over time, Chinampa-like systems, raised fields in shallow water, began to appear along lake fringes. Though their apex would come centuries later, the conceptual groundwork had long been present. To grow food, one had to move earth and control water. This effort transformed cultural identity. To engineer land was to enact order upon chaos, a theme replicated in Mesoamerican cosmology. By the late Classic period, 600–900 CE, societies across the basin exhibited a common symbolic grammar: quadripartite urban layouts, central temple platforms, solar alignments, and calendrical observances tied to the 260-day ritual cycle. Ceramic styles, particularly tripod vessels, incised braziers, and polychrome drinking cups, show cultural diffusion between the Valley of Mexico and regions as distant as Guerrero and Puebla. The political map was fractured, but its conceptual frameworks were shared. Civilization here evolved not in a vacuum, but as a network. After the Toltec decline, the valley entered a phase of fragmentation. Dozens of Altepetl, city-states led by dynastic lineages, coexisted in competitive interdependence. Excavations at places like Coatlinchan and Colhuacan have revealed local temples, civic platforms, and ball courts built with regional stone and decorated with stylized jaguar and maize motifs. Radiocarbon sequences place these features firmly in the post-classic period, 900–1200 CE, indicating continuous urban occupation. None of these cities achieved the superregional dominance of Teotihuacan, but many preserved its institutional echoes: hereditary priesthoods, calendrical keepers, tribute tax in kind, and military orders bound by oath and attire. Language played a critical role in this continuity. By 1000 CE, Nahuatl had become the lingua franca of the highlands. Though spoken with regional variations, it linked diverse communities through poetry, diplomacy, and ritual. Glyphic inscriptions and codices from the era reveal a society increasingly literate in iconographic shorthand, a hybrid of pictorial and syllabic representation. Codices such as the Borgia group, though painted later, contain cosmological schemas and calendar counts that reflect centuries of inherited symbolic systems. Writing was not yet bureaucratic, it was sacred, but it encoded a worldview that ordered time, space, and social function. Meanwhile, the economy of the basin thrived on specialization. Highland obsidian was mined and distributed in pre-cut cores to regional workshops. Salt was evaporated in shallow basins at lakeshore towns. Feathers, shells, and dyes came through long-distance trade from coastal regions. Archaeobotanical data from sites around Otumba reveal extensive maguey cultivation, a versatile plant used for fiber, beverage, and ritual. The valley was not merely a cluster of city-states. It was an interlinked economic organism that converted microenvironments into macronetworks of production and redistribution. And yet within this equilibrium, stress endured. Competition over land, water rights, and tribute flows occasionally sparked war. Border conflicts between Altarpetal were documented not only in oral histories, but in symbolic murals and portable codices. Fortified hilltop sites such as Huaxtacatl and Xochitepec point to increasing militarization by the 12th century. Excavated arrowheads, sling stones, and defensive palisades reveal a shift. War was no longer just seasonal raiding, it had become strategic and territorial. In this tense ecology of competition, a marginal migrant group would find a foothold. They were called the Mexica. The Mexica were not the only migrants. From approximately 1100 to 1300 CE, waves of Chichimca-speaking peoples descended from the arid north into the Valley of Mexico. These groups were semi-nomadic, organized around kin-based units, and maintained ritual ties to tutelary deities linked with the sun, war, and fertility. The term Chichimca, used broadly and often pejoratively by sedentary Nahu elites, referred less to a single ethnicity and more to a mode of life seen as less urban, less ordered, but spiritually potent. Colonial-era codices and annals, particularly the Codex Boccherini and Historia Tolteca Chichimca, preserve mythicized accounts of these migrations. Long journeys across sacred landscapes, divinely ordained signs, and periodic settlement trials. The Mexica distinguished themselves within this migratory wave through the gradual elevation of a singular deity, Huitzilopochtli, the hummingbird of the south. A god of sun and war, Huitzilopochtli was unique among Mesoamerican pantheons for his explicitly martial cosmogenesis. Unlike Quetzalcoatl, the civilizing deity associated with wind and wisdom, or Tlaloc, the rain god of agriculture, Huitzilopochtli demanded conquest as cosmic necessity. His mythic birth, emerging fully armed from his mother Coatlicue to slay his siblings, mapped violence onto the origin of order itself. For the Mexica, this narrative was more than theology, it was instruction. Ethnohistoric records suggest that the Mexica entered the valley in the late 13th century, settling temporarily at sites such as Chapultepec and Tizapan. Archaeological strata in these locations reveal abrupt shifts in ceramic styles and domestic patterns, indicating new inhabitants alongside earlier populations. The Mexica arrived as outsiders, landless, tributeless, without noble ancestry recognized by the valley's dynastic powers. Their early years were marked by dependency, labor service, and clientage to more established polities like Culhuacan and Azcapotzalco. In exchange for land or military protection, they provided warriors and workers. They were tolerated, not welcomed. Yet this marginality fostered cohesion. The Mexica developed tightly organized Calpulli clan structures with embedded religious and military obligations. Oral histories speak of internal councils, specialized military orders, and a growing priesthood devoted to calendrical observance and ritual sacrifice. Excavations at early Mexica settlements have revealed modest temples and household altars bearing figurines and incense burners shaped in the likeness of Huitzilopochtli and Xiuhtecuhtli, fire and time. Even without monumental architecture, the ideological infrastructure of a future state was forming. Myth, migration, and necessity fused into a collective identity. By the early 14th century, Population pressure and political friction forced the Mexica to relocate. Tradition holds that their leaders were shown a vision, an eagle perched on a cactus devouring a serpent. But this image, central to their founding myth, was likely codified after the fact. Strategic logic suggests that they moved onto a marshy island in Lake Texcoco for pragmatic reasons. The site was defensible, centrally located among major Altepetl and adjacent to aquatic resources ideal for Chinampa development. What others dismissed as uninhabitable, the Mexica saw as opportunity. In 1325, according to the best-aligned calendrical reconstructions, they began building Tenochtitlan. This settlement, though initially modest, marked a rupture. It was a statement of permanence from a people until then defined by movement. Using wooden stakes and packed mud, they stabilized the marsh and laid the first stones of what would become a city of temples, markets, and canals. Tenochtitlan did not emerge ex nihilo. Its builders drew on centuries of inherited knowledge, hydraulic engineering from Teotihuacan, ceremonial orientation from Toltec traditions, and lake agriculture practiced by dozens of neighboring towns. But they assembled these fragments under a new ideological axis: divine war as the foundation of order and sacrifice as its maintenance. The transition from migratory outsiders to city founders was not linear. For several decades, the Mexica remained politically subordinate to more powerful neighbors. They paid tribute to Azcapotzalco, whose rulers dominated the western basin through military force and strategic marriages. The Mexica served as mercenaries in regional conflicts, gaining battlefield experience and recognition. In particular, their alliance with the Tepic House of Tezozomoc gave them military exposure and access to tribute flows. But as their city expanded and their population grew, so too did their political ambitions. Evidence from early Tenochtitlan, now largely beneath the modern capital, points to a rapid evolution in civic and ceremonial scale during the first half of the 14th century. Traces of basalt foundations, post-hole alignments, and refuse layers containing marine mollusks, maize husks, and sacrificial remains indicate a growing central plaza flanked by residential and ritual structures. The city's layout began to reflect a quadripartite division, a spatial logic found throughout Mesoamerica, with zones oriented to cardinal directions and temple precincts aligned with solar movements. These decisions were not aesthetic, they were cosmographic. To build a city was to remake the universe in miniature. Political elevation followed infrastructural consolidation. By the late 14th century, the Mexica began forging independent diplomatic ties with other Altepetl, leveraging marriage alliances and mercenary reputations into greater autonomy. Codices from the early colonial period, such as the Codex Mendoza, detailed tribute exchanges and battlefield honors that marked this transitional phase. Tenochtitlan had not yet become hegemonic, but it had moved beyond subordination. The Mexica were no longer merely serving others' wars, they were beginning to shape the terms of engagement. Material culture corroborates this shift. Burial sites from the mid-14th century within the Tenochtitlan zone reveal grave goods of increasing wealth: jade beads, obsidian knives, ceremonial masks, and shell inlays sourced from distant coasts. This accumulation of exotic materials suggests not only rising elite status, but integration into expanding trade networks. Marketplaces in Tenochtitlan, likely modest at first, began to rival those of more established centers like Texcoco and Tlatelolco. Merchants, Pochteka, operated as both economic agents and intelligence gatherers, bringing back not only goods but geopolitical knowledge from far-flung regions. Through this period, ritual and war remained inseparable. The Mexica calendar, a dual system combining a 260-day ritual cycle and a 365-day solar count, regulated agricultural rites, naming conventions, and military campaigns. Priests tracked celestial movements from simple observation platforms and stone markers, using alignments with the sun, Venus, and seasonal constellations to determine auspicious days for war or harvest. The integration of calendrical precision into decision-making gave religious authority to political actions. To go to war on the appointed day was not merely strategic, it was cosmically required. A deeper psychological transition also unfolded. As the Mexica built and fought, they began to absorb and reinterpret the ideological debris of fallen civilizations. They collected relics from Toltec sites, embedded ancient motifs into new temples, and composed origin myths that linked them to divine ancestors. This process was not fabrication. It was cultural appropriation as legitimacy building, a way of inheriting the grandeur of Teotihuacan and Tula by staging themselves as their spiritual successors. In stone and speech, the Mexica claimed the past as prologue. Meanwhile, the basin around them remained politically fragmented. The altarpetal system encouraged local independence, balanced by shifting alliances and tribute pacts. While warfare was frequent, it was ritualized, constrained by season, terrain, and custom. Azcapotzalco remained dominant west of the lake, while Texcoco grew in literary and religious prestige to the east. Dozens of other city-states maintained varying degrees of autonomy. This mosaic was fertile ground for a rising power adept at diplomacy, coercion, and cosmology. The Mexica, drawing from generations of marginalization and mobility, had learned to navigate fractured systems, and now they sought to dominate them. By 1375 CE, the Mexica installed their first recognized ruler, a Campechichtli, blending Mexica lineage with Colhua noble blood. This was more than a dynastic move. It was a statement of legitimacy, the transformation of a migrant warrior band into a royal house. A Campechichtli's reign marked the end of the purely formative phase and the beginning of Mexica's statehood. During his rule, temple construction accelerated, tribute systems formalized, and intermarriage with regional elites expanded the Mexica's influence. Tenochtitlan had emerged not only as a city, but as a sovereign power with sacred mandate. By the early decades of the 15th century, the once fragmented political landscape of the Valley of Mexico was entering a period of consolidation. Azcapotzalco, the long-dominant Tepic city-state, had exercised hegemony through military power and strategic vassalage. For nearly a century, the Mexica of Tenochtitlan had remained under its influence, both constrained and empowered by their role as tributaries and auxiliaries. But internal tensions grew. After the death of Tezozomoc, the Tepic overlord, succession disputes erupted. His son Maxtla assumed power, alienating former allies and sowing distrust across the lake cities. This rupture created opportunity. In 1426, the Mexica ruler Itzcoatl forged a bold alliance with Nezahualcoatl of Texcoco and Totoquihuasli of Tlacopan. The resulting military coalition, the foundation of what would later be called the Triple Alliance, launched a successful campaign against Azcapotzalco. The victory was decisive. Excavated weapons caches and burned structures at the Tepic capital corroborate the violence recorded in indigenous annals. Azcapotzalco's fall was not merely a regime change, it marked the end of one era and the beginning of another. The Mexica, once subjects, had become arbiters. Yet their rise cannot be understood solely through conquest. It was the culmination of centuries of adaptation, cultural appropriation, environmental engineering, and ideological synthesis. The Mexica did not invent the Mesoamerican city. They inherited it, restructured, reinterpreted, and ritualized it to fit their vision of cosmic order. They used war not only as a tool of dominance, but as a sacrament. They constructed Tenochtitlan not just as a city, but as a mandala, a symbolic center where gods, rulers, markets, and seasons converged. The Basin of Mexico had always been a stage of civilizations, each building atop the ruins of its predecessors, each layering new meanings on old stones. The Mexica arrived late, but they studied the script, learned the cues, and rewrote the performance. Their empire would not last long in historical terms, scarcely a century from dominance to destruction. But its roots reached deep, tapping the aquifers of older cities and older cosmologies. Before the empire rose, the ground had already been prepared by millennia of human hands, digging, planting, praying, and remembering. The Mexica stepped into a world already ancient. What they built would astonish not because it came from nowhere, but because it came from everywhere, assembled from the fragments of fallen cities, shaped by lake and lineage, and driven by the conviction that their time, at last, had come. The Mexica did not appear in the Valley of Mexico as conquerors. They arrived as refugees, landless, politically untethered, and burdened by a mythology that placed them both inside and outside of history. Their origin, according to later accounts compiled under colonial oversight, was Aztlan, a semi-mythical island to the north, interpreted by some as a real place, by others as a symbolic homeland. The journey from Aztlan to the basin spanned generations. Codices such as the Boccherini and Orban represent this migration not through linear narration, but through a visual sequence of footprints, dates, and signs, caves, temples, battles, and celestial portents. The Mexica's identity was inscribed as movement, an odyssey across landscape and time. What is historically discernible, however, lies not in the myth, but in the pattern. Like other Chichamca groups, the Mexica descended into the Central Plateau between the 12th and 13th centuries CE. Linguistic reconstructions indicate their dialect of Nahuatl retained archaic northern forms, marking them as late arrivals among more established Nahu-speaking populations. Early ethnographic sources, cross-referenced with archaeological surveys, suggest that the Mexica initially settled in transitory encampments near Chapultepec, a forested hill west of Lake Texcoco. There they clashed with regional powers, particularly Culhuacan, and were expelled. Stratified midden deposits at Chapultepec contain projectile points and domestic refuse consistent with short-term military occupation rather than permanent habitation. Their presence had been felt, but not welcomed. What followed was a pattern of marginal occupation, temporary residence on the lake's peripheries, intermittent labor service under powerful altarpetal, and gradual integration into tributary systems. Around 1299, the Mexica negotiated with Culhuacan's Tlatani to settle at Tizarpan, a rocky area on the lake's southern edge. In exchange, they provided military assistance against neighboring rivals. Their position remained precarious. Sources record an incident in which the Mexica sacrificed a Culhua princess, intended to solidify an alliance by removing her heart in a ritual to Huitzilopochtli. To the Culhua, this was barbaric. To the Mexica, it was sacred duty. The alliance shattered. The Mexica were again expelled. Their options narrowed. Surrounded by enemies, lacking ancestral lands or legitimate kingship, the Mexica retreated to the marshy islets of Lake Texcoco. In these inhospitable shallows, they saw not failure but revelation. There, legend holds, they beheld the prophetic sign, an eagle perched on a cactus, devouring a serpent. Though likely a retroactive symbol, this moment encapsulated the Mexica worldview, divine sanction through adversity. In 1325, they began construction of a permanent settlement, Tenochtitlan. Initial decades were defined by survival. The terrain demanded ingenuity. The Mexica drove wooden stakes into the lakebed, filled gaps with soil and stone, and created habitable land. Early dwellings were modest, thatched huts, reed mats, and compact shrines, but beneath these structures lay a blueprint, both literal and ideological, for transformation. The Mexica had not chosen the center of the lake for its beauty. They had chosen it because it was overlooked. Marginality offered protection. And with time, it would offer power. The founding of Tenochtitlan marked not a culmination, but a pivot. From this precarious island, the Mexica began to construct more than a city. They began to construct meaning. Every causeway laid across the water, every canal dredged, every household plot measured was also a symbolic gesture. Land was not merely reclaimed from the lake, it was wrested from chaos, from non-existence, and made sacred through labor and sacrifice. Chinampa agriculture emerged gradually. Its origins predated the Mexica. They refined it into a high-yield system. Rectangular plots were built from interwoven reeds and mud, staked into the lakebed, and lined with willow trees whose roots stabilized the edges. This system, replicated in grids across the shallows, transformed the landscape into a matrix of production. Botanical remains recovered from early Tenochtitlan indicate an intensification of maize, amaranth, and chili cultivation within 2 generations of settlement. Alongside this physical transformation came a recalibration of social organization. The Mexica restructured their communities into calpuli, kinship-based units responsible for managing land, labor, and ritual obligations. Each calpuli maintained its own temple, leaders, and educational system. Young men trained for war and subsistence, young women for domestic and textile arts. Children were taught to fear laziness, to revere the gods, and to memorize lineage. Social roles were not rigid, but they were delineated. Excavations in residential zones of Tenochtitlan have revealed differential burial goods and dwelling sizes, indicating a stratified but internally cohesive society. Crucially, the Mexica began to weave their mythic past into their urban present. The memory of Aztlan, of the long migration, of the sacrifices and expulsions, these were not buried. They were reanimated in ritual. Calendar festivals commemorated episodes from their migratory journey. Public ceremonies featured reenactments of Huitzilopochtli's divine ascent and the Mexica's early trials. By performing these narratives, they reinforced identity. They were a people forged through exile, sanctified by endurance, and entrusted with cosmic maintenance through blood. Politically, however, they remained junior players. From their settlement until the mid-14th century, the Mexica paid tribute to Azcapotzalco, the powerful Tepic city-state that dominated the Western Basin. This tribute was paid in woven cloth, agricultural produce, labor, and most notably, warriors. Mexica youths were conscripted into Azcapotzalco's military campaigns, gaining experience in battle and exposure to regional power dynamics. While this relationship limited autonomy, it also provided opportunity. Mexica captains distinguished themselves in conflicts against rivals like Chalco and Xochimilco. Military valor became a path not only to prestige, but to political leverage. One such figure was Acamapichtli. Around 1375 CE, following the death of the last tribal leader, Mexica elites sought to elevate their status by selecting a ruler who could legitimize their lineage. They turned to the city of Culhuacan, once their enemy, to request a noble of Toltec descent. Acamapichtli, a prince born of a Culhua father and Mexica mother, was installed as the first Tlatoni, he who speaks, of Tenochtitlan. His reign, lasting until 1395, initiated dynastic monarchy and a shift towards statehood. From this point onward, Mexica rulers would derive authority not just from clan consensus or battlefield prowess, but from inherited sacred lineage. Under Acamapichtli, the city's transformation accelerated. Stone temples replaced earthen mounds. The central precinct was expanded. Tribute lists were standardized and land use codified. Excavations beneath the colonial-era Cathedral of Mexico City, built atop the original ceremonial center, have revealed basalt floors, sculpted altars, and deep offering caches containing obsidian blades, marine shells, and figurines aligned to Huitzilopochtli. These layers date to the late 14th century, confirming the rapid monumentalization of the city. This architecture did more than elevate space. It reframed history. The Mexica were no longer mere migrants. They had become founders, and the city they founded would soon redefine the political map of the valley. Institutional infrastructure, established under Acamapichtli, became the framework through which Tenochtitlan would project power. His successors continued the consolidation of Mexica society into a unified but segmented organism, a city whose social order mirrored cosmic design. The Calpulli remained the primary unit of land distribution, but leadership roles became increasingly hereditary. Meanwhile, new offices emerged: judicial stewards, ritual specialists, and tribute overseers. Through a combination of oral tradition and emerging record-keeping, the Mexica began to inventory the resources, obligations, and lineages of their society. This bureaucratic impulse would mature into one of the most detailed tribute systems in the pre-Columbian world. Religious life expanded in parallel. The Mexica did not abandon the older gods of the region, Tlaloc, Xipe-Totec, Quetzalcoatl, but subordinated them within a newly dominant solar theology centered on Huitzilopochtli. The Templo Mayor, the city's primary ceremonial structure, grew in phases. By the end of the 14th century, it housed dual shrines atop a pyramidal base, one to Huitzilopochtli, the other to Tlaloc. This pairing was ideologically potent. Huitzilopochtli represented war, time, and sacrifice. Tlaloc represented fertility, rain, and agricultural abundance. Together, they encapsulated the Mexica worldview, life and death, as reciprocal obligations. Archaeological excavations have uncovered dedicatory caches between construction phases, obsidian blades, child skeletons, stingray spines, and marine offerings from hundreds of kilometers away. These were not decorative deposits. They were theological assertions, ritual evidence that the gods had been fed and the cosmos recalibrated. Militarization continued as both necessity and ideology. Boys were trained from a young age in physical endurance, use of weapons, and ceremonial discipline. Capturing, not merely killing, enemies became the supreme measure of martial skill. This emphasis stemmed not from cruelty, but from ritual logic. Sacrifice demanded living bodies, and the gods, according to Mexica priests, required nourishment in human form to sustain the sun's motion. Warfare, then, was less about conquest and more about cosmic maintenance. As the city grew in wealth and ambition, this belief system justified expansion. It sanctified violence. Diplomatically, the Mexica still operated within a tight balance. Azcapotzalco loomed to the west, overseeing tribute and enforcing allegiance. To the east, Texcoco fostered a rival intellectual and religious tradition. Between them, smaller city-states jockeyed for trade access and land. The Mexica navigated this matrix through selective alliances and strategic marriages. They solidified connections to Toltec lineages, borrowed ceremony and costume from elite courts, and positioned their rulers as heirs to a deeper civilizational order. They were newcomers only in chronology, not in cultural fluency. By the early 15th century, internal pressures in Azcapotzalco created fractures. The death of Tezozomoc in 1426 ignited a succession crisis between his sons. Maxtla, who seized power through intrigue, alienated many client states. The Mexica, long subordinate yet increasingly self-confident, recognized the shift. Under the leadership of the Tlatonicitzcotl, and with the alliance of Texcoco and Tlacopan, they turned against their former overlords. The war was brief, brutal, and decisive. Azcapotzalco fell, its tribute system was dismantled, its elite were executed or absorbed. Tenochtitlan, once a dependent island in a marsh, had emerged as a co-equal power. The formation of the Triple Alliance in 1428 transformed Mexica's status. Tenochtitlan, Texcoco, and Tlacopan divided tribute from conquered provinces, with Tenochtitlan gradually claiming the lion's share. This redistribution of wealth allowed for massive temple expansions, military reforms, and market regulation. But more importantly, it allowed the Mexica to reframe their own history. No longer migratory upstarts, they positioned themselves as the center of a divinely ordained order. Their journey from Aztlan, once a tale of hardship, became a prophecy fulfilled. Their previous dependence was rewritten as divine testing. Their conquest was not ambition, it was destiny. The arrival of the Mexica into the basin had not disrupted the region's long civilizational arc. Rather, it continued it, drawing from old symbols, ancestral strategies, and ecological constraints. Yet the Mexica brought a new fusion of movement and settlement, of memory and monument, of myth and realpolitik. Their city would grow into the largest in the hemisphere. Their empire would come to dominate from the Pacific to the Gulf. And their gods, once invoked in marginal marshes, would be fed with captives from 100 cities. The Mexica had arrived not to imitate the past, but to inherit and eclipse it. The transformation of Mexica identity from migratory outcasts to imperial progenitors did not occur solely through institutions and war. It was also mediated through language, symbolism, and spatial imagination. Nahuatl, the Mexica's language, became more than a communicative tool. It became the medium through which authority, lineage, and cosmology were expressed. As Tenochtitlan grew, scribes and priests began encoding history in visual textual formats. Codices emerged as repositories of both knowledge and ideology. Using stylized glyphs, spatial sequencing, and calendrical dates, these manuscripts recorded migration routes, dynastic successions, tribute obligations, and ceremonial rites. Though most surviving codices were produced after the conquest, many reflect pre-Hispanic models in their structure and lexicon. In these records, the Mexica were never passive recipients of history. They curated it. They positioned their ancestors among the noble Toltecs, traced divine approval through eclipses and omens, and aligned major events with cosmic cycles. This interpretive framework made every act, from the dedication of a temple to the birth of a prince, part of a universal pattern. The city itself was imagined as a replica of the cosmos, quadrants radiating from a central axis, canals standing in for celestial rivers, marketplaces reflecting the ordered chaos of creation. To walk through Tenochtitlan was, symbolically, to traverse the layers of the universe. This symbolic geography extended into political claims. The Mexica began to construct their own historical legitimacy through the retroactive canonization of events. For example, the founding of Tenochtitlan in 1325 was increasingly treated not as a pragmatic settlement, but as a divinely timed event, predicted by prophecy, marked by omens, and confirmed by astronomical alignment. Huitzilopochtli, once a tribal deity of war, was elevated to cosmic primacy. His temple, situated alongside that of Tlaloc, now received the highest sacrifices. In some ceremonies, captives were slain on staircases stained with previous offerings, their hearts lifted skyward as the sun passed directly overhead. These acts were not spectacle for its own sake. They were affirmations, ritual statements that the world remained balanced only through Mexica action. Meanwhile, the city's urban fabric expanded. By the 1440s, Tenochtitlan's population exceeded 50,000 and continued growing rapidly. New calpulli were established, each responsible for producing warriors, farmers, and tribute. Temples multiplied. The central precinct became a complex of ritual buildings, platforms, and storage houses for tribute and sacred paraphernalia. Markets, particularly at Tlatelolco, a sister city absorbed by Tenochtitlan, grew to accommodate thousands of daily traders. Spanish chroniclers, including Bernal Diaz del Castillo, would later express astonishment at the volume and order of these marketplaces, comparing them favorably to those of European cities. In this period of rapid growth, the distinction between historical memory and political theology became increasingly blurred. The migration from Aztlan, once a lived experience passed through oral tradition, became formalized into myth. The foundation of Tenochtitlan was reenacted annually. The Mexica calendar placed sacred anniversaries alongside tribute collection and military campaigns. Time itself was restructured, not as linear progression, but as cyclical reaffirmation. To defeat a rival was not merely a political victory, it was the reenactment of divine conquest. This ideological consolidation would become critical in the decades to follow, when the Mexica began their transformation from city-state to empire, yet its roots were laid here in the careful construction of a usable past. Migration became mandate, exile became initiation, and settlement became sacrament. In the eyes of the Mexica, they had not arrived late to civilization. They had arrived exactly when the gods demanded it. At the center of Lake Texcoco, in terrain dismissed by surrounding city-states as inhospitable, the Mexica enacted one of the most ambitious urban engineering projects in the ancient world. Tenochtitlan was not founded on firm ground, but on a cluster of swampy islets and shallow marshes subject to flooding, brackish seepage, and seasonal instability. To build in this environment required more than architecture, it demanded ecological transformation. From its founding in 1325 through the late 15th century, the city evolved into a hydraulic and urban marvel, sustained by artificial land, polder-style causeways, aqueducts, and a ritual core aligned with celestial mechanics. Tenochtitlan was not an accidental capital. It was a deliberate construction of empire from water, soil, and stone. The first infrastructural challenge was stabilization. The lakebed's soft clay substrate, deposited over millennia of tectonic depression and hydrological runoff, was ill-suited to masonry. To counter this, the Mexica adapted older regional techniques and drove wooden pilings deep into the ground to anchor foundations. These pilings, often made from cypress and willow, were arranged in grids and reinforced with compacted soil, volcanic gravel, and woven reed mats. Evidence of this technique survives beneath Mexico City today, where archaeologists have discovered layers of post holes and stone platforms built atop concentric retaining rings. Such substructures allowed for the gradual elevation of the urban platform without permanent subsidence. Beyond stabilization, the Mexica redefined the relationship between land and water. Chinampa agriculture, previously used by Xochimilco and other lakeside communities, was elevated to new scale and systematization. These raised fields, created by dredging lake sediment and enclosing it with reed fences and tree-lined berms, turned aquatic margins into hyperproductive zones. Chinampas measured roughly 30 by 2.5 meters and were laid in rectilinear arrays separated by canals. The soil, replenished by nutrient-rich silt, yielded multiple harvests per year. Core samples from surviving Chinampa zones reveal successive layers of alternating organic matter and construction fill, indicating centuries of active cultivation. As the city expanded, its layout evolved into a meticulously ordered grid. Tenochtitlan's central precinct, the Teocalli, was surrounded by concentric zones of residential compounds, workshops, markets, and administrative buildings. Excavated street alignments beneath modern-day streets such as Monda and República de Argentina confirm a cardinal orientation. Streets radiated outward from the ceremonial center like spokes, intersected by canal crossings spanned by removable wooden bridges. This design served both transit and defense. In times of invasion, the bridges could be retracted, isolating the city core. Water management became an enduring priority. While Lake Texcoco's western margins were brackish, its eastern tributaries supplied fresh water from mountain runoff. To deliver potable water, the Mexica constructed a dual aqueduct system from Chapultepec, consisting of parallel stone-lined channels, one in use while the other underwent maintenance. The aqueduct's foundations were supported by adobe and volcanic stone piers spaced at regular intervals, parts of which have been excavated near Avenida Chapultepec. This infrastructure enabled the delivery of clean water into cisterns and reservoirs, essential for both daily use and temple ritual. Monumental architecture kept pace with the urban sprawl. The Templo Mayor, whose earliest iteration began in the late 14th century, underwent at least 6 major expansions by the arrival of the Spanish. Each construction phase buried the previous one, symbolically layering history while materially asserting dominance. Offerings placed between levels, jaguar bones, incense burners, human remains, carved obsidian, and sea coral narrate a theology of accumulation. The temple itself stood as a layered axis mundi, connecting underworld, terrestrial domain, and celestial sphere. Its twin staircases ascended to shrines of Tlaloc and Huitzilopochtli, uniting reign and war as twin engines of empire. The scale of urban transformation extended far beyond the ceremonial core. As Tenochtitlan's population surged past 100,000 by the mid-15th century, demands on infrastructure, sanitation, food production, and water regulation grew exponentially. Civic planners, likely priests and nobles versed in calendrical and spatial logic, orchestrated the expansion of districts into clearly demarcated quadrants. These 4 quarters, named Moyotlan, Tiopan, Atzacualco, and Cupapan, were both administrative and symbolic, reflecting the Mesoamerican model of the universe as a 4-part plane anchored by a central axis. Each quadrant housed its own temples, markets, armories, and schools, Karmikak for nobles, Tolpochcali for commoners, ensuring that governance, warfare, and cosmology were spatially embedded in daily life. Transportation across this aquatic city relied on a dense network of canals. Canoes served as primary vehicles for moving people, tribute, food, and building materials. Market goods, cacao, obsidian, woven textiles, dried fish, maguey fiber, and copper tools circulated constantly through this amphibious grid. The layout was not improvised. Canal widths were standardized, banks reinforced with stone and tamped earth, intersections marked by shrines or waystones. This aquatic mobility lent the city remarkable efficiency and also a kind of visual coherence. Low-slung boats gliding between Chinampa rows, priests ferrying offerings to temple precincts, soldiers dispatched silently at dawn through mirrored waters. Defensive planning was equally advanced. 3 major causeways, Tepeyac, Iztapalapa, and Tlacopan, connected the island city to the mainland. These structures, constructed of packed stone and earth, rose above the lake's surface and allowed pedestrian and cart traffic year-round. Each causeway was punctuated by drawbridges and gatehouses. In times of military threat, these bridges were removed to isolate the city. According to both Nahuatl and Spanish sources, this tactic was employed during several conflicts in the late 15th century, demonstrating that engineering had become part of strategy. The lake, in these moments, was not a barrier to be overcome, it was a moat, a shield. Sanitation and waste management, often overlooked in ancient urban studies, also received attention. Human waste was collected in ceramic vessels and reused as fertilizer on chinampas. Sweeping and refuse removal were assigned to designated castes. Bernal Dias, decades later, would observe the cleanliness of Tenochtitlan's streets and the organization of its market refuse zones. Archaeological layers corroborate this. Stratified deposits in residential compounds contain limited domestic waste, suggesting removal and recycling. Pollen analysis from lakebed cores also shows consistent renitrification, likely due to the return of composted matter into agricultural zones. These patterns reveal not accidental hygiene, but intentional planning. At the heart of all this, symbolically and physically, stood the Templo Mayor. With each expansion, the temple complex grew taller and broader. Sculptures of Coyolxauhqui, the moon goddess slain by Huitzilopochtli, were installed at its base, their placement echoing the mythic moment of cosmic order imposed through violence. Priests ascended its steps with regalia of eagle feathers, jade inlays, and obsidian daggers. Sacrificial platforms were washed with blood and copal. Yet the temple was not simply a locus of violence. It was a visual calendar, a stage for seasonal rites, and a pedagogical device. Every festival, every offering reinforced the rhythm of time and the permanence of Mexica cosmology. While the Templo Mayor rose in prominence, so too did the city's administrative architecture. Government compounds known as Tecpan were constructed to house legal, fiscal, and diplomatic operations. These buildings, often rectangular courtyards surrounded by columned porticos, served as both courtrooms and offices for the bureaucracy that managed tribute, land disputes, and military logistics. Excavations beneath modern government buildings in central Mexico City have unearthed stone columns, drainage systems, and remnants of painted walls suggesting civic iconography, jaguars, eagles, calendrical glyphs that communicated authority and ancestral lineage. These were not palaces in the European sense. They were functional centers of record-keeping and decision-making, where scribes worked with reed pens and painted codices to tally maize quotas or schedule rituals. The documentation practices that emerged in Tenochtitlan were both pictographic and numerical. Tribute was recorded in standardized iconography, bundles of cloth, loads of firewood, jars of chili, cacao beans, copper bells, and war captives were each rendered with precision. Codices such as the Mendoza and the Matritans, compiled later, but preserving earlier models, show rows of towns and their obligations, often arrayed around concentric pathways symbolizing the administrative orbit of the empire. Scribes trained in Karmakak schools were taught to memorize and render these details. The act of recording tribute was not passive documentation. It was a mechanism of power, a way to project Tenochtitlan's reach across hundreds of tributary towns. Markets formed the economic pulse of the city. The central market at Tlatelolco, adjacent to but administratively distinct from Tenochtitlan until its later absorption, drew tens of thousands of traders daily. Ethnohistoric sources suggest that goods were arranged by material type and function, regulated by merchant guilds and overseen by appointed judges who settled disputes on site. No money in the form of coinage existed. Exchange operated through standardized commodities, cacao beans for small transactions, cotton mantles or gold dust for larger ones. Spanish observers repeatedly expressed astonishment at the scale, order, and diversity of the market, noting that it rivaled any they had seen in Europe or the Levant. The urban population, by the late 15th century, surpassed 200,000, making Tenochtitlan one of the largest cities in the world at the time. Its growth was not merely the result of birth rate, but of centripetal migration. Artisans, merchants, tribute specialists, and administrators from across the expanding empire were brought to the capital to serve or train. Some arrived voluntarily, others under obligation, but all contributed to the cosmopolitan layering of the city. Residential neighborhoods grew dense but organized, with clay brick housing, internal courtyards, and shared shrines. Drainage canals ensured waste was carried away, while rainwater was collected in ceramic cisterns or stone-lined reservoirs. This convergence of engineering, administration, and religious performance shaped the experience of urban life in ways few ancient cities matched. To live in Tenochtitlan was to inhabit a ritual topography, one in which streets followed cardinal alignments, temples echoed celestial geometries, and time unfolded through festivals. Every structure bore meaning. Every procession reaffirmed hierarchy. Every marketplace bore witness to the empire's expanse, as turquoise from the north, seashells from the south, feathers from the rainforest, and obsidian from distant mountains arrived in woven baskets carried on human backs. Yet beneath this order lay fragility. The city's dependence on hydraulic engineering made it vulnerable to environmental shifts. Seasonal flooding could breach causeways or contaminate freshwater channels. Extended droughts placed pressure on Chinampa yields. Earthquakes occasionally fractured temples and homes, as archaeological fault line studies beneath central precincts now confirm. The Mexica addressed these through ritual and repair. Droughts summoned mass ceremonies to Tlaloc. Earthquakes were interpreted as signs of cosmic imbalance, requiring special sacrifices. Engineering was thus never fully secular. It was embedded in theology, justified through cosmology, and sustained by performance. These vulnerabilities did not undermine the city's permanence. They reinforced its need for constant ritual affirmation. The Mexica interpreted environmental volatility as evidence of the universe's instability, a cosmos sustained not by divine inertia, but by human action. As such, every storm, flood, or tremor was met with intensified offerings, a recalibration of time through blood. The urban body, in their view, was not self-sustaining. It required maintenance through construction and ceremony alike. This cosmological premise pervaded even the city's most utilitarian aspects. Roads were not simply paths between neighborhoods, they were ritual avenues used in processions to mark equinoxes or new fire ceremonies. Canals were not merely agricultural infrastructure, they carried not only goods but iconographic effigies during festivals. Bridges were raised and lowered in accordance with not just threat but timing. Urban rhythm in Tenochtitlan was lunar and solar, sacred and strategic. Time pulsed through the city in cycles of planting, battle, tribute, and ceremony. The spatial logic of power manifested in both the horizontal expansion and vertical symbolism of the city. Tenochtitlan's skyline, such as it was punctuated by pyramidal temples whose summit altars framed both public spectacle and celestial convergence. From the top of the Templo Mayor, priests had unobstructed sightlines toward distant volcanoes, sacred hills, and the stars themselves. Alignments were intentional. Solstices and equinoxes were tracked by the movement of shadows across plaza stones and temple stairs. The built environment was a calendar, a fixed landscape upon which the heavens cast their timekeeping. Materially, these constructions required immense labor and organization. Tribute from subordinate towns included not only food and textiles, but stone, lime, timber, and laborers. Records show that regional provinces were responsible for supplying specified quantities of building materials, transporting by canoe across the lake system, and distributed by central authorities. Elite artisans, often hereditary, oversaw the carving of glyphs, placement of iconographic friezes, and painting of murals in ceremonial buildings. Color schemes followed symbolic conventions: red for war and life, black for the underworld and divine knowledge, turquoise for fire and time. Even pigments were tributed, refined from insects, minerals, or resins. Though built by human hands, the city's ideological blueprint was inherited. Tenochtitlan drew heavily from older urban precedents: Teotihuacan's grid, Tula's temple forms, and the altar petals' social logic. Yet in Tenochtitlan, these were compressed and intensified. Where earlier cities had dispersed functions across terrain, the Mexica condensed them. The sacred, the bureaucratic, the economic, and the residential existed in overlapping proximity, reinforcing the sense that all life was part of a single cosmic matrix. The city was not segmented, it was recursive. The gods were in the streets as much as in the temples. By the eve of Spanish arrival in 1519, Tenochtitlan had become both spectacle and system. Its size rivaled the greatest cities of the known world. Its administrative complexity matched that of dynastic China or the Islamic caliphates. But what distinguished it most was its totality. the extent to which every architectural line, every agricultural field, every ritual day was interwoven into a unified worldview. It was a city built in defiance of geography and entropy, and it stood as proof, in the minds of its builders, that the Mexica had fulfilled their divine inheritance. In 1428, a political rupture shattered the long-standing hierarchy of the Valley of Mexico. The collapse of Azcapotzalco, the once dominant Tepic city-state, marked the end of one imperial order and the genesis of another. This shift was not accidental. It was the result of careful maneuvering by the Mexica of Tenochtitlan, who, after decades of subordination, seized an opportunity to recast themselves from vassals to hegemons. With the death of the powerful Tepic ruler Tezozomoc, a succession dispute opened the door to resistance. His son Maxtla's rise alienated long-standing allies. Sensing instability, the Mexica formed a pact with two former rivals, Texcoco and Tlacopan. The coalition would become known to posterity as the Triple Alliance. The war that followed was swift and transformative. In alliance with Texcoco's Prince Nezahualcóyotl, himself displaced and embittered by Tepic politics, the Mexica launched coordinated military campaigns against Azcapotzalco. Codices and post-conquest narratives describe a string of sieges, ambushes, and diplomatic isolations. Archaeological evidence from the Western Basin corroborates these accounts. Charred building foundations, hastily buried weapon caches, and signs of rapid abandonment in Tepic administrative centers. When Azcapotzalco fell, the structure of authority in the region collapsed with it. The Mexica, once tributaries, now redrew the lines of power. Triple Alliance formalized a new imperial framework. Tribute territories were divided among the three cities, but unequally. Tenochtitlan received two parts of each assessment. Texcoco and Tlacopan each received one. This asymmetry reflected the Mexica's military dominance and ensured their primacy. Tribute was no longer a local affair, it became systemic. Provinces were categorized by their level of integration, directly ruled, indirectly governed, or hostile and unstable. Each had tailored obligations in the form of maize, cacao, textiles, copper axes, warriors, or ceremonial goods. The Codex Mendoza, compiled decades later but preserving earlier records, illustrates these arrangements with remarkable clarity. Rows of pictorial entries, town glyphs, tribute icons, and calendrical cycles form a mosaic of economic extraction. War was the engine of this expansion. Unlike modern statecraft, diplomacy in the Triple Alliance was rarely a substitute for violence, it was its preamble. The Mexica maintained a standing force of elite warriors drawn from noble youth and seasoned captains. They also cultivated religious orders of combat, the Eagle and Jaguar warriors, distinguished by costume and ritual obligations. These were not mere military units. They were embodiments of divine attributes, charged with capturing prisoners for sacrifice and exemplifying martial virtue. Every campaign was preceded by ritual augury and followed by public ceremony. Warfare was less about territorial annexation than tribute and captives, economic and cosmological yield. Strategically, the alliance expanded in concentric waves. Nearby city-states were subdued first, then integrated into military coalitions for further expansion. Each conquest brought new resources and positioned the empire to absorb the next. Resistance was met with overwhelming force, then ritual incorporation. Temples were rededicated to Huitzilopochtli, markets were taxed, and local dynasties were either deposed or married into the imperial order. The logic was accumulative. More provinces meant more tribute, more captives, more legitimacy. And yet, consolidation required more than conquest, it required narrative. The Mexica, now dominant within the Triple Alliance, began to retroactively frame their ascendancy as foreordained. Through temple inscriptions, codices, and ritual drama, the story of their rise was fused with mythic inevitability. The military victories of Itzcoatl, and later his successor Moctezuma I, were not presented merely as conquests, but as restorations, a divine reclaiming of order from Tepic decadence. Central to this ideological transformation was the systematic rewriting of history. During the reign of Itzcoatl, the priestly class, with the Tlatoani's consent, is said to have burned older codices and commissioned new ones. These acts were not censorship in the modern sense, but a means of historical recalibration, to sever ties with past subjugation and establish the Mexica as rightful heirs of cosmic mandate. At the core of this narrative was Huitzilopochtli, now fully redefined as the imperial god of sun and war. His mythology, particularly the slaying of his sister Coyolxauhqui and the dismemberment of enemies, became metaphors for political domination. The Mexica were his chosen people, and their expansion mirrored his cosmic battle against darkness. Every war, every act of tribute collection, every offering atop the Templo Mayor reenacted this celestial struggle. The line between cosmology and policy dissolved. To resist Mexica rule was to obstruct the sun's motion, to provoke apocalypse. These ideological underpinnings were reinforced by ceremony. As the empire grew, so too did the scale and frequency of ritual. New fire ceremonies, held every 52 years to reset the calendar cycle, became massive spectacles of renewal. The city was darkened, hearths extinguished, and a human sacrifice performed atop a specially prepared platform. Fire was drawn anew from the chest of the victim and distributed across the city, rekindling cosmic order. These events involved not only Tenochtitlan, but emissaries from across the empire, who brought tribute and reaffirmed allegiance. They were both theological events and political summits, theater of empire at planetary scale. Tribute extraction, the economic engine of expansion, was tightly managed. Territories were grouped into Tlatonian-assigned provinces, each responsible for regular deliveries of specified goods. Tribute officials, often stationed locally, maintained codices that recorded volume, frequency, and shortfalls. Defaulters were punished not only through physical coercion, but through humiliation, destruction of temples, abduction of nobles, or forced public displays of submission. Yet many provinces complied without resistance, for inclusion in the imperial web brought certain protections against local rivals, against drought through food redistribution, and access to the economic network centered at Tenochtitlan. The market system, anchored by the great Tianguis at Tlatelolco, expanded alongside the tribute economy. It functioned as a clearinghouse where goods extracted through force mingled with those acquired through voluntary trade. Pochteka, long-distance merchant guilds, operated semi-autonomously, often with imperial sanction, penetrating regions not yet conquered and returning with exotic materials. Turquoise from the north, tropical bird feathers from the south, cacao from the coastal lowlands. These merchants served dual purposes. Economically, they expanded the reach of Mexica goods and currency systems. Politically, they gathered intelligence on vulnerable city-states, acting as commercial scouts for future conquest. Yet even as the imperial system tightened, fractures formed beneath its surface. Many conquered provinces remained culturally distinct, retaining local languages, deities, and kinship structures. Integration was strategic but rarely complete. The Mexica permitted religious plurality, but elevated Huitzilopochtli above all. They tolerated local rule, but only within tribute quotas and loyalty expectations. This tolerance was pragmatic, not ideological. As a result, beneath the veneer of cohesion lay a mosaic of resentment, populations that acquiesced but did not assimilate, cities that complied but did not forget their independence. The imperial apparatus, for all its precision, was stretched across deep cultural fault lines. Among the mechanisms used to hold the empire together, public architecture and ceremonial spectacle were paramount. Every major conquest was followed by the dispatch of architects, artisans, and priests from Tenochtitlan, tasked with reshaping local sacred spaces. Temples were rededicated, altars recalibrated to imperial rites, and processional spaces modified to accommodate Mexica festivals. In the provincial capital of Melinalco, for example, a circular temple carved directly into the mountainside was constructed, its interior walls bearing eagle and jaguar imagery associated with elite warrior orders. Stratigraphic analysis dates the structure to the reign of Axiacatl, a generation after the initial conquest. It is emblematic of a strategy employed across Mesoamerica to transform the physical environment as a way to normalize imperial presence. Education was another vector of consolidation. The Carmacac and Tolpochcali systems, already established in Tenochtitlan, were replicated in key tributary cities. In Carmacac schools, Sons of nobles were trained in astronomy, ritual language, codex interpretation, and political history, an imperial curriculum designed to reproduce the ideology of Mexica supremacy. In Tolpochcali, commoner youth received military training, learned agricultural technique, and were socialized into civic obedience. These institutions functioned as both training centers and cultural transmission nodes, creating local elites who were fluent in the Mexica worldview even as they retained distinct ethnic origins. These efforts helped stabilize the empire during the 1460s and 1470s, a period of rapid territorial growth under Moctezuma I and his successor Axayacatl. During this time, campaigns extended Mexica influence deep into the Oaxaca Valley, the Gulf Coast, and the Central Highlands. Glyphic battle records, painted onto hide scrolls and bark paper codices, detail a relentless march of conquests, city by city, year by year. These campaigns were justified not only as strategic necessities, but as sacred obligations. The sun, it was said, needed an ever-growing supply of captives to complete its celestial arc. Without war, the world would stop. The ritual of war was itself deeply codified. Before a campaign, omens were read, sacrifices made, and emissaries sent to demand submission. If rejected, a formal declaration of war was issued through a set of ritual exchanges, obsidian blades, arrows, and cloaks. The first battle was expected to produce captives rather than annihilation. The defeated were offered integration. Those who resisted again faced full destruction. This two-tiered system allowed for flexible outcomes, either political incorporation or cosmological obliteration. Archaeological evidence from towns such as Coixtlahuaca and Tehuantepec reveal both outcomes. In some places, temples dedicated to Huitzilopochtli alongside intact local structures. In others, burn layers and population decline suggest permanent subjugation. Yet the more the empire grew, the more tenuous its integration became. Supply lines stretched farther, requiring logistical innovation. Tribute warehouses, often placed near major lake crossings or market hubs, stored grain, weaponry, and textiles for both consumption and redistribution. Canoe fleets operated across the valley's waterways, carrying everything from maize to prisoners. Still, the administrative strain was mounting. The central bureaucracy expanded, requiring more scribes, more messengers, more judges. The codices grew longer, the glyphs more complex, the rituals more elaborate. Expansion was no longer solely a matter of ambition. It had become necessity, an economic and ideological treadmill with no room for stasis. The psychological burden of empire began to surface in Mexica ritual. Sacrificial numbers increased, festival durations lengthened, omens were tracked with greater anxiety, priests reported strange occurrences, comets, eclipses, malformed births, and lightning strikes on temple summits. These were interpreted not as isolated anomalies, but as cosmic signals, warnings from the gods that the balance was under threat. The sun, they feared, might tire, and if the sun faltered, so would the empire. By the late 15th century, the Mexica vision of empire had reached its apogee, territorially vast, economically interlocked, ritually exhaustive. But with this peak came the paradox of imperial overextension. Newly conquered regions, particularly in the distant highlands and coastal lowlands, required increasingly aggressive pacification. Revolts were not uncommon. In 1486, the region of Huaxteca rose against tribute obligations. The response was swift and emblematic. Imperial armies raised settlements, captured thousands, and returned with enough captives to stage one of the largest sacrificial ceremonies in recorded Mexica history. Chroniclers report that during the reconsecration of the Templo Mayor under Ahuitzotl, upwards of 20,000 individuals were sacrificed over 4 days, their bodies cast down the temple stairs, their blood seeping into the plaza's stonework. This scale of violence was not only performative, but logistical. The ceremony required coordination across hundreds of towns, the movement of captives, food, offerings, and musicians, the synchronization of priestly calendars, and the political attendance of regional elites. From the imperial perspective, such spectacles reinforced the divine hierarchy, Tenochtitlan at the center, all other cities in orbit. For subordinate rulers, attendance was both obligation and test, a demonstration of fealty, a reaffirmation of the world's structure. Refusal was noted, resistance was remembered. Despite its scale, the empire remained structurally thin. No standing army garrisoned the provinces. No Mexica governors replaced local dynasts. Instead, control was exerted through fear, ritual dependency, and the constant threat of return. The altarpetal, the city-state unit, was never dismantled. It was harnessed. The empire was a lattice of tributary nodes, tied together by roads, envoys, calendars, and the ideology of sacred war. But this lattice could flex and eventually break. The absence of deep administrative integration meant that loyalty could be withdrawn as quickly as it was offered. The very system that enabled rapid expansion left the empire brittle at its edges. Still within the basin of Mexico, the imperial presence felt monolithic. Tenochtitlan's size, wealth, and ritual gravity drew artisans, scholars, and emissaries from across Mesoamerica. Sculptors carved imperial imagery into basalt. Poets composed in Nahuatl with metaphors drawn from conquest. Astronomer priests refined their predictions with instruments aligned to the Templo Mayor's staircases. Cultural production flourished under this regime, not in spite of its violence, but through it. The ideology of the Triple Alliance rewarded excellence in war and artistry alike. Warriors who captured 4 prisoners could ascend to noble status. Artisans whose work adorned state temples gained political influence. Power was not inherited alone, it was proven. And yet the ideological equilibrium began to fray. As omens accumulated and demands intensified, a sense of fragility crept into imperial ritual. The ceremonies grew more urgent, the cosmology more brittle. Historians debate whether the Mexica sensed the approaching catastrophe, but the record reveals a growing preoccupation with disorder. Portents such as flaming skis, floods, and deformities were increasingly logged. The priesthood began consulting older codices with renewed fervor, searching for precedents. The empire had once drawn strength from myth. Now it looked to myth for warning. By the final years of the 15th century, the Mexica had established the most expansive and ideologically saturated empire in the history of Mesoamerica. Their dominion was material and metaphysical, etched into stone and memory alike. But beneath its grandeur lay a deep tension between control and resentment, between spectacle and sustainability. The Triple Alliance had turned the Mexica into arbiters of cosmic balance. Yet in doing so, it bound them to a vision of order that could not bend. And when the ships appeared on the eastern coast, pale wood and foreign cloths, the empire would not break from within. It would shatter under the weight of its own design. In the Aztec world, theology was not an abstraction. It was a blueprint. Every institution, from royal succession to grain storage, was traced along cosmic principles rooted in creation myths, solar cycles, and sacrificial reciprocity. The state did not simply sponsor religion. It was religion, materialized in architecture, ritual, and law. Governance and cosmology were intertwined so completely that the boundaries between policy and prophecy vanished. To rule was to interpret the heavens, to align the city with celestial rhythms, and to feed the gods the sustenance they required: time, attention, blood. Central to this system was the myth of the fifth sun, a narrative that situated the current world age as the final in a succession of cosmic eras, each destroyed by imbalance and human failure. According to priestly interpretation, the fifth sun, Tenochtitlan, had only agreed to rise after the gods had sacrificed themselves at Teotihuacan. This precedent established the principle of cosmic debt. Human society owed a perpetual offering to sustain the sun's movement. If neglected, the world would end in darkness. The implication was clear. Sacrifice was not cruelty, it was continuity. This worldview was encoded in the built environment. The Templo Mayor, Tenochtitlan's ritual center, was the physical axis of this cosmic structure. Its twin shrines atop a shared pyramidal base represented the dual engines of divine order: Tlaloc, god of rain and fertility, and Huitzilopochtli, god of sun and war. Each stairway staged the journey of offerings, maize and children for Tlaloc, warriors and captives for Huitzilopochtli. The structure was reconsecrated multiple times, each expansion symbolically burying the old world and erecting the new. Offerings discovered beneath its floors: obsidian blades, carved skulls, marine shells, tropical seeds, and even jaguar remains, traced the empire's geography as much as its cosmology. Priests known as Tlenamakak and Teohua were more than intermediaries. They were engineers of sacred equilibrium. They fasted, bled themselves, performed calculations to align festivals with celestial movements, and led public rituals that reaffirmed cosmic order. Their training began in childhood and involved mastery of calendrics, oration, and the interpretation of portents. Their tools were not metaphorical: codices, star charts, incense, and obsidian knives. Every eclipse, drought, or hailstorm was a problem to be solved ritually, a signal that the balance had shifted and required rectification. Calendrical precision governed everything from market days to military campaigns. The tonal Pohuali, a 260-day ritual calendar, interlocked with the Zu Pohuali, a 365-day solar cycle, creating a matrix of named days and sacred intervals. Only certain days were favorable for sowing, for war, or for the enthronement of kings. Priests interpreted these cycles not as superstition, but as science, an empirical pattern etched into time by divine precedent. The empire's temporal structure was thus circular, recursive, and sacred. Time did not pass. It returned, and it had to be met properly. Religion's penetration into statecraft was total. To disobey the king was to disobey the divine order. To defy a ritual obligation was not just impious, but treasonous. Law codes embedded religious infraction alongside civic crime. Blasphemy, adultery, theft from temple grounds all merited public punishment, often performed ritually. Judgment was handed down by nobles trained in both law and theology. Authority flowed from the gods, and it flowed through the priesthood, the calendar, the king. This model of control was not imposed upon the people. It was taught, rehearsed, and believed. Education in the Mexica world was mandatory and stratified, but uniformly infused with theological content. Young boys and girls were taught to memorize sacred hymns, to identify calendrical signs, and to recognize the symbolic meanings of animals, colors, and numbers. In the Karmakak, where sons of the nobility trained, the curriculum was rigorous: astronomy, rhetoric, codex interpretation, military ethics, and ritual etiquette. Discipline was strict. Students rose before dawn, fasted regularly, and slept on cold stone. The goal was not personal advancement. It was attunement to cosmic order. To serve the state was to serve the gods. Meanwhile, in the Tolpochcali, commoner youths prepared for military service and civic labor. Though less formalized in cosmology, their training too was framed within sacred duty. Even agriculture was ritualized. Maize planting followed calendrical signs, and each stage of growth involved offerings to Chichimequotl, the maize goddess. Harvest festivals were choreographed reenactments of fertility myths, involving masked dancers, public feasting, and symbolic sacrifice. Thus, from schoolyard to field, daily life was saturated with metaphysical consequence. Religious festivals formed the pulse of the empire. Each month of the Zu Pohuali was anchored by a major ritual event, at least 18 in total, ranging from agricultural renewal to martial commemoration. The Tlacaxaipualistli, or Feast of the Flaying of Men, honored Zyp Totic through ritual combat and skinning of sacrificial victims, symbolizing rebirth and vegetation renewal. The Panquetzalistli, dedicated to Huitzilopochtli, involved grand processions, mass sacrifices, and the raising of sacred banners. In each case, the entire city participated. Artisans prepared costumes and regalia. Merchants funded offerings. Families adorned altars. The ruler, priests, and military orders all took the stage, reifying hierarchy through collective devotion. These performances were not static tradition. They were dynamic strategies of integration. Provincial leaders were often summoned to Tenochtitlan to witness or participate. They brought their own local regalia, danced in prescribed forms, and offered tribute to central temples. By doing so, they enacted submission not merely to the state, but to the theological vision it embodied. To refuse was to question the very scaffolding of the cosmos. Temples across the empire, though diverse in size and style, followed a shared symbolic grammar. Dual staircases, elevated shrines, inward-facing altars, and orientations to cardinal directions repeated the central logic of Tenochtitlan's sacred core. In cities like Texcoco, Colula, and Texcoco, local traditions endured but were reframed within the overarching imperial paradigm. The image of the sun, the eagle, and the flint knife became common motifs, carved into thresholds and painted onto codices. These symbols were not imported by fiat. They were embedded through ritual, education, and repetition. The empire's control was not only over space, it was over meaning. The reach of religious statecraft extended even into the afterlife. Mexican cosmology outlined a complex map of the soul's journey, with destinations determined not by moral conduct, but by manner of death. Warriors who died in battle or sacrifice ascended to accompany the sun. Women who died in childbirth joined them, honored for generating life through blood. Others traversed layered underworlds, ruled by Mictlantecutli, facing trials that echoed mythic origins. These destinations were reinforced in burial rites. Excavated grave contain offerings tailored to the deceased's status and expected journey, jade for the breath soul, food for the path, figurines for protection. The dead were not gone, they were repositioned. The connection between theology and sovereignty reached its most concentrated form in the figure of the Tlatoni, the supreme ruler of Tenochtitlan. He was not merely a king or general, he was the terrestrial axis through which cosmic order was mediated. His palace stood adjacent to the Templo Mayor not by convenience, but by design. He bore regalia modeled after divine prototypes, turquoise diadems, jaguar pelt capes, sandals of woven gold. During public rituals, he embodied Huitzilopochtli, walking in processions as both man and deity, his presence a living reaffirmation of Mexican cosmology. His speech, carefully scripted and delivered through ritual forms, was sacred utterance, prophecy, and law intertwined. In his investiture, the new Tlatoni underwent symbolic death and rebirth. He fasted, bled, and communed with the gods through vision and ordeal. He was then presented to the people not simply as a successor, but as a continuation of cosmic alignment. His legitimacy depended not solely on noble blood or conquest, but on demonstrated piety and ritual competence. He had to be a statesman, a warrior, and a theologian, a triad of functions reflecting the three axes of empire: tribute, battle, and sacrifice. From this center radiated a network of religious specialists: fire priests, skywatchers, dream interpreters, and calendar keepers. Their collective labor maintained the equilibrium of the world. They regulated temple observances, calculated the movement of Venus, and interpreted dreams for signs of disease or unrest. They tracked eclipses, monitored omens, and prepared the correct chants and offerings for each ceremonial cycle. Ethnographic records suggest that even mundane decisions, crop planting, house building, trade expeditions, were first submitted to priestly consultation. The sacred calendar governed not only sacred matters, it governed life. Dual calendar system itself, the 260-day tonal Pohuali and the 365-day Zu Pohuali, intersected at 52-year intervals in what was considered a dangerous moment of cosmic uncertainty. If proper rites were not performed, the world could end. The culmination of this cycle was marked by the binding of the year's ceremony. All fires were extinguished. Darkness spread across the city. Priests ascended a mountain temple with sacrificial victims. Only when the fire was successfully drawn from the chest of the offering and rekindled across the city did the world resume. This ritual did not merely mark time, it reset the cosmos. Material culture reinforced these beliefs in everyday life. Household altars, found throughout Tenochtitlan and its tributary towns, bore small effigies of gods, bundles of maize, obsidian blades, and incense pots. Domestic rituals, births, weanings, marriages were performed according to calendrical guidance. Figurines, often painted and dressed, were buried under floors or placed in rooftop shrines. Religious knowledge was not confined to priests. It was shared, practiced, and transmitted across generations. The state required it to be so. Cosmology also governed geography. Sacred maps, both painted and remembered, defined spaces not by physical boundaries, but by ritual significance. Mountains, caves, springs, and crossroads were imbued with divine presence. Pilgrimage routes stretched across the empire, connecting remote shrines to the sacred center. The most famous of these was Tepeyac, where Tonantzin, an Earth Mother deity, was venerated long before her later syncretic transformation. These sites, marked with monuments, offerings, and seasonal gatherings, formed a landscape of memory and power. The empire was not a grid, it was a constellation. And beneath it all, sacrifice, far from a marginal or excessive act, sacrifice was the linchpin of the entire system. Whether through auto-sacrifice, self-cutting with obsidian or maguey spines, or public offerings on temple altars, the shedding of blood was seen as nourishing the universe. It replicated the original sacrifice of the gods. It stabilized the sun's path. It fed the earth. Captives taken in battle were not executed as punishment. They were honored as messengers to the divine, their hearts the currency of renewal. Through this lens, sacrifice was not simply a ritual act, it was a theological necessity grounded in political logic. The stability of the empire depended on the constant recreation of order through blood and time. In the Mexica view, human beings were not born innocent but indebted. Each life was a gift from divine self-sacrifice, and its repayment through service, suffering, or death maintained the structure of the cosmos. This belief was not peripheral. It justified the militarization of society, the subjugation of provinces, and the construction of monuments aligned with celestial movements. It gave purpose to pain, structure to history. But this structure demanded constant reinforcement. As the empire grew, so too did the scale and frequency of ritual. The reconsecration of the Templo Mayor in 1487, under the reign of Ahuitzotl, marked a crescendo in imperial theology. Tens of thousands of captives, drawn from recent campaigns in Oaxaca, the Aztec coast, and the Mixteca altar, were sacrificed over 4 days. Eyewitness accounts, including post-conquest testimonies and colonial codices, describe a city transformed, its streets lined with flowers, its lake colored red, its staircases slick with blood. Musicians played drums and conch shells. Dancers spun in masks of godly faces. The spectacle was total, and at its heart stood the ideology of cosmic equilibrium, that through this violence, order had been preserved. The empire's theology was coherent, but not universally accepted. In the outlying provinces, where local traditions endured, the imposition of Mexica religious forms was sometimes met with quiet resistance. Some altars were rededicated, but not regularly maintained. Some provincial festivals incorporated imperial symbols only perfunctorily. In certain cases, rival priesthoods maintained alternative interpretations of the fifth sun narrative. Yet Tenochtitlan's cultural and military power largely subdued dissent. Temples were rebuilt, festivals standardized, calendars synchronized. The empire became a ritualized federation in which difference was tolerated, but hierarchy was clear. And yet as the 16th century began, signs of strain surfaced. Omens, or what were perceived as such, were increasingly recorded. Unusual animal births, fire raining from the sky, a temple struck by lightning, the moon obscured for days. These events, logged by priests and remembered by commoners alike, were interpreted not merely as signs of meteorological or natural variation, but as breaches in divine order. Anxiety spread. Prophecies were revisited. Codices were unrolled and scrutinized for parallels, warnings, and instructions. Priests debated the meanings, rulers intensified offerings, and rituals grew more extravagant, not out of hubris but out of urgency. The empire had aligned its fate to the health of the cosmos, and now the signs seemed to indicate fracture. Religion had unified the empire, but it had also created a system that could not admit doubt. If the gods turned their faces away, or worse, if they demanded a new cycle, then no amount of stone or sacrifice could prevent the unraveling. Tenochtitlan remained a city of splendor, its plazas alive with processions, its pyramids resplendent with banners, its markets filled with goods from across the continent. But above it all hung the silence of the heavens, increasingly watched, increasingly feared. The empire had built its foundations on divine consent. And now, as whispers grew of strangers landing on distant coasts, of weapons and animals never before seen, the priests turned toward the sky and asked the oldest question in Mesoamerica. Had the fifth sun begun to flicker? The reign of Moctezuma I, from 1440 to 1469, defined the structural essence of the Aztec Empire. Though his predecessors had laid the foundation, forging the Triple Alliance, reordering ritual practice, and expanding the reach of Tenochtitlan, it was under Moctezuma I that the Mexica vision coalesced into a stable, codified imperial apparatus. His rule marked a shift from opportunistic conquest to deliberate state-building. From warfare to water management, temple design to tribute law, Moctezuma shaped not only the empire's terrain, but its ideological and bureaucratic contours. In his reign, the empire did not merely grow, it matured. Unlike his father Huitzilihuatl, who had emphasized diplomacy and marriage alliances, Moctezuma assumed power as a seasoned warrior and a devout student of theology. He had served as Tlachtcalcatl, a high-ranking military commander, and his enthronement followed the death of Itzcoatl, the first ruler to expand the Mexica from city-state to imperial core. Upon his elevation, Moctezuma immediately turned to institutional refinement. He reconvened priestly councils to standardize religious calendars, ordered the revision of tribute records, and formalized the responsibilities of Calpulli leaders in the provinces. His vision was clear: centralized hierarchy, sacred legitimacy, and perpetual expansion. One of his earliest acts was to initiate a new phase of temple construction. The Templo Mayor, already a monumental presence, underwent a dramatic expansion. Stoneworkers, architects, and ritual specialists from across the basin were conscripted to raise its height, widen its base, and rebuild its summit shrines. This was not merely an architectural project, it was a theological statement. With each additional tier, the temple extended the city's axis vertically into the realm of the gods. Beneath its foundations, offering caches were laid in stratified order: aquatic animals, figurines, seeds, and jade, materials drawn from the empire's growing periphery. In building the temple higher, Moctezuma also mapped the empire outward. This project coincided with major military campaigns. Under his command, Aztec armies moved south and east, conquering the regions of Oaxaca, the Gulf Coast, and parts of the Mixteca. These were not quick raids but sustained incursions, involving complex siege tactics, hostage negotiations, and long-distance logistics. Glyphic records, preserved in codices and carved on stelae, show towns falling one by one: Coixtlahuaca, Tlachtquiojo, Ixtacamaxtitlan. These conquests provided not just tribute in cacao, gold, and feathers, they yielded human captives required for imperial ritual. Every campaign served a dual purpose: economic integration and cosmic debt payment. But military success was insufficient without administrative structure. To ensure the durability of imperial expansion, Moctezuma I instituted a tribute system of unprecedented complexity. Territories were surveyed, categorized, and assessed not by arbitrary estimation, but through detailed record-keeping. Provinces were classified into three broad types: fully integrated, semi-autonomous, and hostile. Each was obligated to deliver goods at intervals based on crop cycles and proximity to Tenochtitlan. Local rulers, often left in place under the condition of loyalty, became intermediaries in the imperial hierarchy. They oversaw collection and transmission of goods, while their compliance was monitored by imperial inspectors and traveling officials trained in both rhetoric and enforcement. Codices such as the Mendoza and Matritans later preserved the visual and numeric frameworks of this system. Rows of glyphs for cotton cloaks, maize bundles, obsidian blades, honey pots, and rubber balls were painted in precise counts, linked to town emblems and calendar dates. These records were not decorative. They were operational, updated regularly, and reviewed by scribal houses within the Karmakak. This administrative scaffolding allowed Tenochtitlan to grow from a dominant city-state into a multi-ethnic imperial hub, not through direct occupation, but through calibrated tribute and symbolic supremacy. Moctezuma also turned his attention to water infrastructure. In response to a devastating flood in 1449, he ordered the construction of dikes and aqueducts around the lake perimeter. The most significant was the Nezahualcoatl Dike, named after his ally and co-ruler in Texcoco. This massive earthen barrier, reinforced with stone and timber, stretched across the lake's eastern edge, separating brackish and fresh water and protecting agricultural zones from seasonal inundation. Sediment analysis in the former lakebed shows a marked decline in saline deposits after its construction, evidence of its ecological impact. This hydraulic engineering was more than practical, it was ideological. The tamming of water echoed the Mexican myth of cosmic struggle, chaos overcome by structure, nature bound by ritual geometry. The dike project also reflected the political collaboration between Tenochtitlan and Texcoco, two of the three pillars of the Triple Alliance. Moctezuma and Nezahualcoatl, though leading separate cities, governed in ideological tandem. Together, they codified laws that blended religious ethics with civil order. Texcoco became a center of intellectual refinement, home to libraries, observatories, and poetry councils. Tenochtitlan maintained military supremacy and ritual centrality. The synergy between the two allowed the empire to present itself as both the sword and the scroll, conquest and culture intertwined. In the provinces, Moctezuma deployed a dual strategy of coercion and ritual integration. Conquered towns were not only assessed for tribute, they were also inducted into the empire's sacred chronology. Calendars were synchronized with Tenochtitlan. Local festivals were shifted or reinterpreted to align with imperial ceremonies. Images of Huitzilopochtli and Tenochtitlan were carved onto provincial temples. In many cases, conquered rulers were brought to Tenochtitlan to witness major sacrifices, not as participants, but as audience, their presence symbolic of cosmic submission. These rituals did not erase local identities, but they reframed them within an overarching theological hierarchy. Difference was permitted, but only in the context of Mexican dominance. As Moctezuma I expanded the empire's territorial footprint, he refined its ideological grammar. Central to this project was the elevation of the Mexica origin narrative, their migration from Aztlan, their divine selection by Huitzilopochtli, and their rise from marginality to supremacy. Under Moctezuma's directive, priestly scribes recompiled these histories into codices and public orations. Murals and stone carvings in temples began to depict not only gods, but ancestors, founding figures such as Tenoch and Acamapichtli, shown receiving omens, planting banners, or offering blood in archetypal poses. The Mexica past was no longer a series of remembered episodes. It was canon. This canonization served political ends. As newly conquered peoples entered the empire, they were not merely annexed through tribute, they were enrolled into a story. That story justified Mexica dominance not by accident of arms, but by inevitability of myth. The fifth sun required a center. That center was Tenochtitlan. All towns, all temples, all tributaries revolved around it, cosmologically, materially, ceremonially. The empire was no longer a collection of conquests. It was an extension of divine time, measured in blood and stone. Moctezuma's own role within this narrative was carefully cultivated. He ruled not as a warlord, but as a sacred administrator. He presided over festivals with solemn precision, offering incense and blood from his own ears and thighs. He received emissaries from distant provinces not with pomp, but with theological decorum, seated beneath feathered canopies, flanked by priests, and guarded by mute warriors whose faces were painted with bones. His palace became both a court and a school, where visiting dignitaries observed rituals, heard poetry, and were taught the laws of tribute and cosmic debt. Governance, in his reign, was ceremony writ large. One of his more subtle reforms was the reorganization of noble status across the empire. In Tenochtitlan, new titles were created: Pipiltin for hereditary nobles, Tecutli for provincial lords, Tilamatini for wise elders and teachers. These titles were increasingly formalized through ritual performance and dress. Featherwork, turquoise jewelry, speech patterns, and seat arrangements all marked one's place in the social cosmos. Moctezuma encouraged similar stratification in the provinces, rewarding loyal towns with rank and regalia. Nobility became not only hereditary, but ideologically standardized. The result was a cultural template that extended far beyond military conquest, a system of belonging that made imperial identity legible. Yet Moctezuma was not blind to the dangers of revolt. He maintained an intelligence network through merchants and tribute couriers who reported unrest, shortfalls, or subversive omens. The priesthood also functioned as a barometer of stability, reading the signs in dream, sky, and disease. When famine struck in 1450–1454, due to severe drought and crop failure, the empire's cohesion was tested. Grain stores dwindled. Prices rose, starvation spread even to the valley's core. In response, Moctezuma opened Tenochtitlan's granaries, organized redistribution to nearby towns, and increased ritual offerings to Tlaloc and Chichimequotl. Human sacrifices multiplied. The rains eventually returned, but not without leaving scars. This episode revealed the fragility behind the grandeur. that even an empire calibrated to cosmic rhythms could be undone by ecological variance. It also confirmed the necessity, in Moctezuma's eyes, of ever greater ritual precision. Subsequent years saw intensified ceremonies, stricter tribute enforcement, and a renewed emphasis on elite schooling. The flood had passed, but the lesson remained. Stability was not given. It had to be sustained through vigilance, observance, and sacrifice. By the final decade of his reign, Moctezuma I had not only expanded the Aztec Empire's geographic reach, but etched its ideological infrastructure so deeply into public life that resistance became not just treasonous, it became cosmologically aberrant. Tenochtitlan stood as the axis of both sacred and political order. Pilgrimage routes radiated outward from the city like arterial paths. Sacred bundles of maize, fire, and blood were dispatched to reinforce alliances, while regional rulers sent their children to be educated in its Karmakak schools. The empire had become a civilizational magnet, drawing in resources, bodies, and meaning. The culmination of Moctezuma's rule came not in a singular conquest or edict, but in the successful fusion of empire and theology. His most enduring legacy was structural, the transformation of Mexican hegemony from martial dominance into an ideological system that could replicate itself across diverse regions without constant violence. Through calibrated tribute, synchronized rituals, codified hierarchies, and a mythology that tied every village to the fate of the sun, Moctezuma created a framework in which subject peoples could exist, as long as they participated in the rhythm of empire. But this very structure, while stable, was inflexible. It demanded continuous performance, calendrical observance, tribute exactitude, ritual submission. It had little room for heterodoxy, no tolerance for long-term deviation. The rituals that upheld the empire were not optional. They were compulsory, cosmic, and cumulative. To fail in sacrifice was to jeopardize the universe. In this system, dissent became disaster, and difference a threat not just to political order, but to existence itself. Moctezuma I died in 1469, his body burned and his ashes interred beneath the sacred precinct he had helped transform. No monumental tomb preserved his likeness, no grand eulogy was carved in stone. Instead, his memory was encoded in the rhythms he set in motion, in the tributary cycles, the heights of the temples, the disciplines of the priesthood, the shape of empire itself. His successors inherited not merely a territory, but a theological machine calibrated to exacting standards. The empire he passed on would continue to grow under Axiacatl and later Tizoc and Ahuitzotl, but it would never again be so cohesive, so ideologically aligned, or so structurally complete. Later rulers would stretch its boundaries further than Moctezuma I had ever imagined, yet they would also strain its foundations. His empire was a synthesis of discipline, theology, and measured expansion. And into that legacy would eventually step another Moctezuma, the second of his name, who would inherit not only the grandeur of an empire, but the burden of maintaining its impossible equilibrium in the face of omens, discontent, and an approaching storm from across the sea. When Moctezuma Xocotzin assumed power in 1502, the Aztec Empire was at its greatest territorial extent, commanding tribute from over 400 city-states, ruling millions of subjects from the Pacific to the Gulf. Yet beneath this imperial expanse, cracks were beginning to form. His ascension marked not only the continuation of dynastic rule, but the intensification of its contradictions. He inherited an empire founded on cosmic duty and martial supremacy, yet already saturated with symbolic obligations, demographic pressures, and a growing unease among both rulers and ruled. Unlike his predecessors, Moctezuma II did not rise from the battlefield. He rose from the priesthood. Trained in the Karmakak from an early age, Moctezuma was a scholar of ritual, a master of ceremonial rhetoric, and a man of rare theological fluency. His speeches, preserved in post-conquest chronicles, reflect an austere mind, one obsessed with fate, purification, and divine legitimacy. When he was selected as Tlatoni, it was not for military conquest, but for spiritual authority. He was seen by the priesthood and noble councils as the perfect vessel, pious, disciplined, articulate, and capable of embodying the sacred office with gravitas. But this theological sensibility, so admired at court, would come to define and haunt his reign. Moctezuma began by asserting control over the court itself. Unlike earlier rulers who governed alongside a relatively open nobility, he restricted access to the palace, elevated ceremonial language, and revised etiquette. Audiences with the emperor became rarefied affairs. Visitors had to remove their sandals, avert their gaze, and speak only through intermediaries. Even longtime allies and generals were kept at distance. This shift was not merely personal, it was theological. Moctezuma understood the ruler as the embodiment of cosmic stability, and to preserve that embodiment, he withdrew it from mundane familiarity. He became the sun, distant, radiant, unapproachable. Simultaneously, he expanded the apparatus of divination and surveillance. The priesthood, now more deeply enmeshed in governance than ever before, received new privileges. Omens were logged meticulously. Portents, strange lights in the sky, twins born under ill-favored signs, temples struck by lightning, were debated in councils and rituals. Moctezuma listened closely to these signs, consulted sages, and fasted in response to cosmological uncertainty. He ruled by omen as much as by edict. Beneath this vigilance lay a growing paranoia that the cosmic order he had inherited might be unraveling, and that some force, internal or foreign, might soon arrive to claim the fifth sun. At the same time, dissent simmered at the empire's edges. Military campaigns continued, but at greater cost. The empire's tribute demands had intensified. Grain shortages in outlying provinces sparked unrest. Local rulers, once deferential, began to grumble against Tenochtitlan's ceremonial excess and unrelenting expectations. Moctezuma, rather than decentralize or accommodate, doubled down on symbolic control. He ordered new rituals, reaffirmed sacred hierarchies, and personally led fasts to intercede with the gods. He believed that only through ritual purity and interpretive precision could the empire be held together. And then the omens intensified. Beginning around 1509, a sequence of anomalous events was recorded by the priesthood and echoed in Nahua oral histories later compiled under colonial transcription. A temple burned spontaneously. A column of fire pierced the sky for nights on end. The lake boiled near Tenochtitlan's causeways. A weeping woman was heard at twilight, lamenting the fate of her children. A bird with a mirror in its head was captured, in which Moctezuma claimed to see visions of armed men riding animals. These signs were not viewed metaphorically. They were direct ruptures in the ordered logic of the cosmos. Moctezuma, deeply attuned to ritual meaning, treated them with increasing alarm. He convened extended fasting retreats atop temples, isolated himself with dream interpreters, and ordered round-the-clock vigilances at sacred sites. The priesthood debated the portents with gravity, offering conflicting interpretations. Some read the signs as divine anger, a consequence of incomplete sacrifices or neglected rites. Others feared the return of Quetzalcoatl, the exiled deity king whose ancient promise of return had never been forgotten. In this atmosphere of heightened cosmological instability, policy became reactive, and leadership increasingly introspective. Internally, Moctezuma's administration grew rigid. Nobles were purged for suspected disloyalty. Military campaigns were launched not only to extract tribute, but to generate captives for urgent sacrifices. The Tlaxcalans, longtime enemies who had resisted imperial incorporation for decades, were targeted with renewed fury. Yet despite several campaigns, the Confederation of Tlaxcala remained unconquered, its mountainous terrain and decentralized military structure frustrating repeated incursions. This failure was not merely tactical, it was ideological. An unconquered altarpetal in the heart of the empire challenged the logic of total dominion, and thus, the stability of the cosmic order Moctezuma sought to uphold. Administratively, the tribute system under Moctezuma became increasingly demanding. Provinces were required to deliver more cloth, more cacao, more laborers, and more captives than before. The strain began to show. Codices and colonial-era tribute inventories indicate arrears, substitutions, and occasional refusals. In response, Moctezuma dispatched imperial inspectors and reinforced the penalties for default. Ritual punishments were carried out, statues of rebellious towns were broken in public, nobles were stripped of regalia, and forced to walk barefoot into ceremonial centers, heads bowed. These acts were intended not only to correct behavior, but to reassert the visual grammar of imperial subordination. Yet despite his efforts, Moctezuma's aura of inviolability began to erode. Commoners, while still deferent in public, whispered of divine displeasure. The elite grew anxious, uncertain whether their emperor's spiritual clarity was protecting the realm or inviting ruin. Even among the priesthood, quiet divisions emerged, between those who insisted on more sacrifice and those who feared the gods were no longer listening. The cosmic balance, once reinforced through ceremony, now felt fragile. And it was in this climate of sacred anxiety that word arrived from the coast. Strange vessels had landed. Bearded men, clad in metal, had come ashore with animals never before seen. They bore weapons that flashed with thunder and smoke. Their speech was unintelligible, their intentions unknown. Messengers sent by coastal governors described diplomatic gestures, gifts exchanged, signs misunderstood. But what mattered most to Moctezuma were not the materials or the men. It was the timing. The arrival coincided too precisely with the omens, too cleanly with the prophecies. He did not dismiss the news. He did not prepare for war. He consulted the heavens. And in that moment, the boundaries between theology and state collapsed entirely. Moctezuma responded to the reports from the coast, not with immediate mobilization, but with ritual inquiry. He summoned the keepers of the sacred books, the interpreters of dreams, and the astronomer priests responsible for tracking the heavens from the slopes of the Templo Mayor. These specialists presented conflicting interpretations. Some argued that the strangers were merchants or warriors from distant lands, no different in principle from Mixtec polities or Tarascan envoys. Others, drawing from ancient pictorial narratives about cycles of creation and destruction, insisted the arrivals were tied to the long-anticipated return of divine forces. The uncertainty paralyzed coherent response. The emperor listened, questioned, and fasted, a pattern that became increasingly common as cosmological anxiety overtook political calculation. In parallel, diplomatic expeditions were dispatched toward the Gulf Coast. These groups carried gifts of gold discs, featherwork, cotton mantles, and cacao, offerings meant to gauge intention and assert imperial protocol. The messengers who returned reported unsettling interactions. The newcomers accepted the gifts with apparent eagerness, displayed weapons of unfamiliar design, and demonstrated animals whose speed and strength confounded the Mexica envoys. These envoys also described the strangers' habit of making signs toward the sky and placing objects upon their bodies that reflected sunlight with unnatural brilliance. Such details only deepened Moctezuma's uncertainty. If these men were mortal, their customs were inexplicable. If they were divine, their arrival posed an existential dilemma. As reports accumulated, Moctezuma retreated further into ritual seclusion. He undertook extended vigils, engaged in auto-sacrifice, and limited his audience exclusively to high priests and a narrow circle of nobles. The palace, already transformed into a space of ceremonial austerity, became increasingly insular. Access protocols tightened. Courtiers moved silently across polished floors, and communication shifted to intermediaries. This withdrawal altered the function of rulership. Instead of commanding the empire through visible presence, Moctezuma governed through symbolism and distance, reinforcing his role as the axis of cosmic order while inadvertently weakening the perception of his authority among military leaders and provincial lords. Meanwhile, military commanders in the field urged preparation. Veterans of campaigns in Oaxaca, the Aztec region, and the Tarascan frontier recognized the strategic implications of foreign arrival. Yet the political structure, shaped by decades of theocratic centralization, allowed little deviation from imperial orthodoxy. Tactical initiative, once distributed among seasoned captains, had been increasingly absorbed by court ritual. Decisions that earlier Tlatoc might have left to battlefield specialists now required cosmological sanction. This centralization, which during Moctezuma I's reign had unified policy, now constrained it. Orders from Tenochtitlan were hesitant, delayed, and saturated with theological caution. The omens intensified after the first diplomatic encounters. Unseasonal frost damaged Chinampa crops. A comet streaked across the night sky. A temple guardian reported hearing voices emerging from beneath the lake. These events, while common in periods of environmental variability, were interpreted through the lens of cosmic instability. Priests performed additional sacrifices, extended the smoke offerings in the sacred precinct, and recited hymns meant to restore astral harmony. Yet the unease remained. The cosmic order had begun to feel porous, vulnerable to external forces the empire was not prepared to assimilate. Within Tenochtitlan, social responses mirrored elite anxiety. Market chatter, recorded later in Nahuatl testimonies, described apprehension among merchants and craftsmen. Tribute flow from some peripheral towns slowed, not purely out of resistance, but from uncertainty about the future. Provincial lords, sensing instability, hesitated to send their heirs to the Karmakak for training. The ideological system that had organized the empire for decades depended on predictable cycles, agricultural, celestial, and ritual. With those cycles disrupted, cohesion faltered. Moctezuma attempted to reassert order through intensified ritual. He led ceremonies invoking Huitzilopochtli more frequently, sponsored temple refurbishments, and commissioned new codices depicting ancestral migrations and divine mandate. These acts sought to reinforce continuity, to assert that the Mexica remained at the center of cosmic design. But the very need to reaffirm this vision signaled its fragility. The empire's ideological machinery, refined over generations, was encountering a domain it could not easily interpret, a phenomenon that lay outside its historical and cosmological framework. By 1519, when the strangers marched inland under banners unfamiliar to every priest and general in the basin, Moctezuma's regime had shifted from confidence to guarded anticipation. Scouts shadowed the foreigners, emissaries delivered gifts and warnings, priests tracked eclipses and stellar patterns for signs that might clarify their nature. All evidence, from Moctezuma's perspective, pointed to a single conclusion: the cosmic order was being tested. Whether by gods returned, ancestors transformed, or mortals bearing unprecedented power, the challenge could not be met by arms alone. It had to be met by interpretation. This interplay of fear, theology, and political rigidity would shape every decision Moctezuma made in the year that followed. The empire stood at its zenith, yet it had never been more uncertain. In the autumn of 1519, Hernán Cortés and his force of roughly 600 Spaniards crossed the mountains into the Valley of Mexico. They had marched inland from the Gulf Coast, where they first landed at Sempoala, forging uneasy alliances with Totonac communities discontented with Aztec tribute demands. As they advanced, they encountered the Confederation of Tlaxcala, long-standing enemies of the Mexica, fiercely independent and militarily seasoned. After intense skirmishes, diplomacy prevailed. The Tlaxcalans, recognizing a rare opportunity to strike at their imperial rival, joined forces with the newcomers. It was not a collision of two worlds alone. It was the convergence of many, each with its own grievances, calculations, and mythologies. The Mexica watched this approach with profound anxiety. Moctezuma, still oscillating between theological interpretation and diplomatic protocol, sent repeated envoys. The first gestures included gifts of jade, featherwork, and finely worked gold, offerings intended both to impress and implicitly to redirect. Yet these emissaries returned with unsettling reports. The foreigners did not behave as expected. They failed to observe ritual norms. They rode animals, beasts unknown to Mesoamerica, and wielded weapons that killed from a distance with a noise like thunder. They neither fled before the sight of Tenochtitlan's grandeur nor paused to make formal obeisance. They advanced. In October, Cortés and his allied armies arrived at Colula. Once a major religious center and a city of pilgrims, Colula had remained nominally within the imperial network, but retained its own ceremonial prestige. There, a massacre unfolded. Spanish sources claimed a preemptive strike against a treacherous ambush. Nahua accounts describe an unprovoked slaughter. Hundreds, possibly thousands, were killed in temple courtyards and homes. The message was unmistakable. These strangers did not obey the rules of ritualized warfare. They did not seek captives. They sought annihilation. The massacre reverberated across the basin. Moctezuma received the news in silence. Then, After weeks of debate and divination, he did what few expected. He invited the foreigners into his city. On the 8th day of November, 1519, Hernán Cortés entered Tenochtitlan. He marched across the causeway from Iztapalapa, flanked not only by Spaniards in steel and cavalry, but by thousands of Tlaxcalan allies, warriors armed with obsidian blades, dressed in regional cotton armor, and harboring decades of resentment against the Mexica. They approached the island city not as lost adventurers, but as a multi-ethnic military column beneath banners of Christian saints and indigenous glyphs alike. The spectacle was without precedent. Moctezuma met them at the southern entrance of the city, near the base of the Great Causeway. He wore the turquoise diadem of kingship, his feet adorned with gold-soled sandals, and his body layered in robes of iridescent green feathers. He descended from his litter and offered no weapons, only words. According to later accounts compiled by both Spanish chroniclers and Nahua informants, he addressed Cortés with ritual formality, calling him a long-awaited lord, perhaps even an embodiment of Quetzalcoatl. The meaning of these words remains contested. Were they sincere theological deference, diplomatic language misread by Europeans, a symbolic gesture meant to defer conflict without conceding sovereignty? What is clear is this: no battle was fought at the gates. The Spaniards were housed in the palace of Axiacatl, a former Tlatoni and Moctezuma's father. It was a deliberate placement, within the ceremonial heart of the city, yet physically separated by walls and canals from the Templo Mayor and the royal compound. From this position, Cortés observed the city's structure, its causeways, its markets, its temples, and its central ritual spaces. His letters to Charles V describe astonishment at the size, at the precision of the urban layout, and at the order of civic life. Yet even as he praised the marvels of Tenochtitlan, he plotted how to seize it. Moctezuma, for his part, maintained a posture of controlled hospitality. He allowed the Spaniards access to markets, permitted them to speak with priests, and ensured they were fed daily with tribute supplies from surrounding provinces. But he also watched them closely. Temple priests reported their strange habits. Local nobles grew uneasy. The presence of thousands of Tlaxcalan warriors, long feared and hated by the Mexica, was an open provocation. Tensions thickened beneath the rituals of courtesy. The turning point came with news from the coast. A second Spanish expedition, led by Panfilo de Narvaez, had landed. Fearing he would lose control of the conquest, Cortés left a garrison in Tenochtitlan and marched east to defeat Narvaez. In his absence, the fragile equilibrium collapsed. Pedro de Alvarado, the Spaniard left in command, feared uprising during the festival of Toxcatl, a major ceremony dedicated to Tezcatlipoca. Whether provoked by genuine intelligence or driven by paranoia, Alvarado ordered a preemptive strike. What followed was a massacre. During the festival of Toxcatl, as dancers circled the ritual courtyard and drums pulsed in the cadence of ancestral homage, Spanish soldiers sealed the temple exits and drew their swords. The celebrants, unarmed, adorned in feathered capes and gold jewelry, were trapped within the sacred precinct. Then the killing began. Eyewitnesses among the Nahua later recounted the scene in chilling detail: limbs severed mid-motion, skulls crushed beneath iron, blood pooling in the sunlit plaza. The rite, once meant to ensure the cycle of time, was cut short by slaughter. No prisoners were taken. There were no demands, no negotiations, only silence afterward. This act, unprecedented in its sacrilegious violence, broke the imperial spell. Word spread across the city in hours. Markets closed, causeways were blocked, the bridges were drawn. Moctezuma, once seen as the mediator between gods and people, was now viewed by many as complicit through his passivity. His authority, already strained, collapsed. When Cortés returned from the coast, now reinforced by Narvaez's former soldiers, he found the city no longer welcoming. Barricades had been raised. Stones and spears greeted his entry. The palace where the Spaniards stayed became a fortress under siege. Moctezuma remained inside, now a prisoner within his own city. According to later accounts, Cortés compelled him to appear on a rooftop and address the people, to calm them, to plead for restraint. But the moment was lost. Stones struck the emperor. Days later he died, whether from wounds, despair, or quiet assassination remains unknown. The intermediary between gods and empire had fallen. The Spaniards now faced a city in open revolt. Supplies dwindled. Their Tlaxcalan allies grew restless. Canals, once avenues of commerce, became choke points of ambush. The night of June 30th, 1520, known in Spanish accounts as La Noche Triste, Cortés attempted a covert retreat across the western causeway. The city, shrouded in lake mist, rose against them. Mexican warriors attacked from canoes, rooftops, and bridges. Many Spaniards drowned under the weight of stolen gold. Others were pulled from the water and sacrificed at temple altars. Of the thousands who began the retreat, less than half reached the mainland. Yet the Mexican victory was incomplete. The imperial structure Moctezuma had maintained, of tribute, submission, and cosmic balance, could not be resurrected. His successor, Cuitlahuac, ruled briefly and with skill, rallying resistance and restoring some internal cohesion. But he died within weeks, likely of smallpox, a disease previously unknown in the Americas, introduced through European carriers. It spread through the valley with devastating speed. Priests, nobles, warriors, scribes, none were spared. Entire calpuli ceased to function. Temples went untended. The balance was shattered not just by invasion, but by biological catastrophe. In these moments, the nature of the encounter became clear. This was not a conflict of symmetrical empires. It was an asymmetrical cataclysm of worldviews, of immunities of time itself. The Mexica had imagined enemies in terms of warfare, sacrifice, and cosmological rivalry. But what arrived were enemies immune to the same pathogens, uninterested in ritual negotiation, and backed by weapons and tactics alien to the valley's strategic imagination. The world had not ended. It had changed irrevocably. In the year following Moctezuma's death, as the empire reeled from disease, disillusionment, and siege, leadership passed to Cuauhtémoc, a young noble of military distinction and fierce resolve. He inherited a city scarred by betrayal and bleeding from its lungs. Still, he refused surrender. Under his command, defenses were reorganized. Bridges were destroyed, supplies were stockpiled, and canal warfare intensified. The Mexica adapted. They turned their lake into a labyrinth of ambush. They understood that this was no longer a matter of homage or diplomacy. It was annihilation or survival. Meanwhile, Cortés regrouped in Tlaxcala, where he brokered alliances not only with Tlaxcalan leaders, but with disaffected towns across the basin. Dozens of city-states, long resentful of Mexican tribute demands or ritual domination, now saw opportunity. Whether out of vengeance, pragmatism, or survival, they joined the Spanish-led coalition. Canoes, warriors, porters, and spies poured into the invaders' ranks. The siege that followed was not a European assault on an indigenous city. It was a convergence of enemies, some ancient, others recent, bent on dismantling the center that had ruled them for generations. Cortés ordered the construction of brigantines, small, shallow-draft ships, assembled inland and carried in pieces to the lake. With these, his forces could challenge Mexican control of the water, cutting off food routes and outflanking canal defenses. Archaeological findings from the lake bed, anchors, hull fragments, weapon caches, confirm the scale of the lake battle. Mexican canoes, nimble and numerous, harassed the Spanish ships by day, retreating by night. But the technology mismatch proved fatal. The brigantines could hold against arrows and obsidian. They were platforms for harquebusiers and crossbowmen. The lake, once Tenochtitlan's shield, became a breach. The siege tightened, markets closed, chinampas burned. Thousands fled to the mainland only to be cut off or turned away. Others starved inside the city walls. Ritual continued as long as strength permitted, sacrifices offered, hymns recited, fires kept alive on the Templo Mayor. But the rhythm faltered. The empire's order, so long sustained through ceremony and repetition, crumbled under exhaustion and hunger. Walls were breached, barricades fell. By August 13, 1521, Cuauhtémoc, cornered in the city's western quadrant, was captured while attempting escape by canoe. The last Tlatoni, bound and bloodied, was brought before Cortés. According to post-conquest accounts, Cuauhtémoc asked only that he be killed swiftly, for he had done all he could for his people. His request was denied. Instead, he was paraded, interrogated, and later tortured in the search for imperial treasure. No gold was found, no tribute recovered. What had once been the jewel of the lake was now ash and silence. The causeways were choked with corpses, temples shattered, codices burned or hidden. A civilization dismantled not only by steel and fire, but by epidemic and betrayal. And yet the Mexica world did not vanish. Survivors rebuilt amid ruin. Nahua scribes adapted to alphabetic writing and recorded their histories, prayers, and losses in the script of the conqueror. Priests continued household rituals in secret. Calendar fragments were painted in corners of colonial codices. Memory persisted, even as empire did not. The encounter had ended in collapse, not mutual understanding, but asymmetry and silence. What rose in its place was not a new synthesis, but a broken mirror. Familiar forms fractured, old gods renamed, new kings seated on altars stained with old blood. Tenochtitlan did not fall in a single moment. It died in increments of flame, of fever, of famine. The final siege, stretching over 3 months in the summer of 1521, was the culmination not only of military pressure, but of systemic unraveling. By the time Spanish brigantines circled the lake and Tlaxcalan war bands cut off access to the causeways, the city was already bleeding from within. Its empire had fractured. Its food lines had failed. Its gods were still fed with blood, but the rhythm was broken. The rituals once meant to stabilize time now echoed in an empire collapsing under the weight of its own cosmology. Cuauhtémoc, appointed in the chaos following Cuitlahuac's death, was barely 25, yet he inherited not a throne but a crucible. He reorganized what remained of the city's defenses, delegating command to senior captains, sending emissaries to sympathetic towns, and reinforcing canal barricades with rubble and spiked pilings. His strategy was rooted in attrition. Tenochtitlan's defenders no longer aimed to repel, they aimed to outlast. The hope was that fatigue or dissension would erode the invading coalition. But the invaders, supplied by an arc of former tributary cities, only tightened their grip. Street by street, the city dissolved. Brigantines swept the canals, their cannons battering walls not built for siege artillery. Disease continued to hollow the population. Smallpox, now endemic, was joined by dysentery and starvation. Survivors foraged among ruins, drank brackish water, and scavenged burned storehouses. Skeletons later recovered from beneath Mexico City revealed trauma consistent with close combat and starvation. Fractured skulls, cut femurs, ribs pierced by projectiles. Each layer of sediment from this period contains ash, broken obsidian, and human bone, a stratigraphy of collapse. And yet resistance did not abate. Even as neighborhoods fell and temples were razed, defenders launched counterattacks. They struck from rooftops, from water, from the debris-strewn streets where order had once prevailed. Rituals were held in secret corners, offerings placed in shattered altars. The city did not surrender until it could no longer move, and even then, it did not bow. As the siege wore on, daily life in Tenochtitlan transformed into a ritual of endurance. Calpuli elders rationed maize husks and lakeweed. Clay vessels, once used for offerings, became makeshift containers for brackish water. Survivors slept in shifts between attacks, often without shelter, surrounded by the dead and dying. What had once been a city of splendor, of polished plazas, vibrant markets, and ceremonial order, became a ruinous battlefield layered with ash and memory. Yet amid this devastation, the structure of resistance remained remarkably intact. Even as temples crumbled, the ideological logic of the empire, duty to gods, honor in death, obligation to ancestors, persisted in action. Cuauhtémoc refused surrender. From within a city quartered by invaders and cleaved by fire, he organized what remained of the priesthood and the warrior societies. Surviving captains of the Eagle and Jaguar orders were redeployed to defend specific canal points and temple staircases. Every street became a redoubt, every rooftop an ambush site. They fought not with illusions of victory, but with the conviction that to resist was itself a form of order, a reenactment of divine struggle, even in the face of erasure. Spanish sources, including Cortés' own letters, describe the ferocity of the final weeks. His men advanced slowly, often gaining ground only to lose it in night counterattacks. Houses were burned to deny shelter to defenders, causeways were widened to allow cannon passage. But these tactics exacted a cost. Spanish soldiers fell to obsidian clubs, arrows, and concealed traps. Tlaxcalan allies, though numerous, faced the wrath of a people fighting for survival, not tribute. The siege became personal. It was no longer about conquest. It was retribution, entropy, and exhaustion. By late July, most of the city had been reduced to rubble. The causeways were choked with debris and bodies. The lake's shallows, once a lifeline for agriculture and trade, became a battlefield of bloated corpses and overturned canoes. Cortés began a final push toward the last redoubt, Tlatelolco, the city's northern sister and the location of its primary market and final temples. The defenders, pressed from all sides, continued to stage coordinated resistance from the ruins of pyramids and the canals surrounding the sacred precinct. Still, the weight of numbers and technology could not be repelled indefinitely. On August 13, 1521, Cuauhtémoc was captured while attempting escape by canoe across the lake. Spanish accounts claim he asked Cortés to kill him to end the agony of defeat with dignity. Cortés refused. The last Tlatani was taken alive, a symbol not of continued leadership, but of imperial dismemberment. Tenochtitlan fell not to a single stroke, but to the slow, grinding erosion of its will, its people, and its gods. The siege ended. The empire did not. The aftermath of Tenochtitlan's fall was not peace, but recalibration, a collision between cultural annihilation and the persistence of memory. As the smoke cleared, Spanish forces and their native allies moved through the ruins with both wonder and calculation. The city's temples were looted. Statues were torn down, their eyes shattered, their mouths defaced. Gold was melted. Jade hoards disappeared. What was not portable was desecrated. And yet, beneath the ash and stone, the structure of the city endured, its canals, its causeways, its ceremonial grid. The conquerors did not destroy it completely, they built atop it. Cuauhtémoc, though imprisoned, remained a figure of symbolic importance. Initially kept alive as a political tool, he was interrogated repeatedly about the location of imperial treasure. His refusal, whether born of defiance, ignorance, or the absence of what his captors sought, only deepened his mystique. Eventually, he was tortured, his feet burned with oil, his silence unbroken. Years later, he would be executed under suspicion of plotting rebellion. His death marked not the end of resistance, but the end of continuity, the final break between the pre-conquest world and the new colonial regime that would emerge. In the months following the conquest, disease ravaged the region once more. Smallpox, typhus, and famine spread along the trade and tribute routes that had once sustained the empire. Entire towns were depopulated. The social fabric of Calpulli communities frayed. Ritual specialists died faster than their knowledge could be passed on. The priesthood, already decimated, fragmented into localized cults, many of which were forced underground. Archaeological surveys in the basin reveal a sudden contraction of settlement density between 1520 and 1525, a collapse not only of imperial power, but of demography. And yet the Nahua world did not disappear. Surviving nobles adapted. They learned to read and write in Latin script. They dictated their histories in Nahuatl to missionary scribes, preserving accounts of migration, empire, and loss in documents such as the Florentine Codex and the Annals de Tlatelolco. These texts, layered with both trauma and agency, became repositories of remembrance, attempts not to resist the new order, but to ensure that the old one was not forgotten. Through these documents, voices emerged that would otherwise have been silenced. In hidden courtyards and family shrines, rituals continued. Offerings were made in private. Calendars were whispered, not recited. The fifth sun, though eclipsed, was not entirely extinguished. Even as crosses replaced temples and Nahua deities were folded into Christian saints, the logic of reciprocity, sacrifice, and cosmic balance endured in syncretic form. The collapse of the empire had not erased its worldview. It had displaced it, forced it into new registers, new disguises, new forms. What fell in 1521 was not merely a city or an emperor. It was an entire system of time, authority, and meaning. Its architecture had mirrored the cosmos. Its rituals had sustained the movement of the sun. Its economy had tied hundreds of towns into a web of tribute, obligation, and ceremony. When that system collapsed, it did not implode silently. It shattered with sound, the sound of stone dragged from temples, of prayers interrupted, of drums silenced mid-beat. But from that silence, echoes remained. The fall of Tenochtitlan marked the end of Mexican political sovereignty, but not the disappearance of their world. In the aftermath of conquest, The city's temples lay broken, its lakes choked with debris, its gods suppressed or desecrated. Yet amid this devastation, the structure of memory endured, refracted through new symbols, translated into new scripts, and whispered through new rituals. The Aztec Empire did not vanish. It became subterranean. Spanish administrators moved quickly to repurpose the sacred landscape. The Templo Mayor's foundations were dismantled, its stones used to build churches and colonial institutions. On the very site of human sacrifice, the cathedral of the new order was erected, not by accident, but by imperial design. The logic was inversion, to overwrite the old cosmos with a new one, but the layers could not be fully erased. Beneath the cathedral, buried beneath meters of fill, the offerings remained. Obsidian blades, carved jaguar skulls, shells from distant coasts, the cosmological grammar of a fallen empire, preserved not by intention, but by stratigraphy. The survivors, nobles, scribes, artisans, farmers, did not disappear. Many adapted, entering the colonial system as intermediaries. They translated not only languages but cosmologies. They served as guides, informants, and municipal officials in the new towns imposed atop old ones. They baptized their children with Christian names, yet passed on oral histories in Nahuatl. Through dictated testaments, painted annals, and ritual performance disguised as Christian feasts, they ensured that the memory of the empire, though transformed, would not fade. In the 16th and 17th centuries, indigenous scribes composed some of the most detailed historical documents of the conquest and pre-conquest period. The Florentine Codex, the Codex Mendoza, the Codex Orban, the Annals de Tlatelolco. These were not simply records, they were acts of reclamation. In them, the Mexica world was not romanticized, but remembered, its rituals, its gods, its eras, its grandeur. The scribes, writing under Spanish supervision, did not write for nostalgia. They wrote to ensure that the bones of their world, its names, its rhythms, its truths, remained traceable. Even centuries later, the ruins continued to speak. Throughout the colonial period, fragments of the Old World persisted in hidden forms. Calendrical glyphs were carved into Christian baptismal fonts. Processions honoring saints followed the same routes as ancient festivals. The Feast of Corpus Christi, introduced by Spanish friars, was celebrated with offerings of flowers, music, and masked dances, its form visibly echoing the pre-Hispanic rituals of Tlaloc and Huitzilopochtli. In highland villages, rituals invoking Saint Michael featured water blessings that bore unmistakable resemblance to those once offered to the rain god. This was not simple syncretism, it was camouflage. In towns across central Mexico, colonial churches rose above platforms that once supported temples. The sacred geography remained intact, even as its surface was rewritten. The logic of duality, sun and rain, war and fertility, life and sacrifice, continued in Christian guise. The Virgin of Guadalupe, said to have appeared on a hill near Tenochtitlan in 1531, quickly became the object of intense indigenous devotion. Her image, dark-skinned and radiant, echoed the earth goddesses of earlier times. Whether by coincidence or intention, her shrine stood near older sites of pilgrimage. Memory, layered through architecture and symbol, refused erasure. Beneath the surface, the physical remains of the Mexica world endured. The temples had been dismantled, but the earth preserved what it was not ordered to forget. In the late 20th century, excavations beneath Mexico City revealed layers of ceremonial offerings beneath the colonial-era street grid. Jade figurines, stingray spines, flint knives, incense burners, seashells, crocodile bones, arranged in precise patterns oriented toward cardinal directions, interred beneath layers of volcanic rock. These caches, untouched for centuries, testified not only to the scale of ritual but to its deliberate choreography. Each item was placed with intention, forming a cosmological message sealed in earth. Stratigraphy became scripture. As archaeologists unearthed layer after layer, they did not discover ruins alone, they discovered continuity. The urban plan of Tenochtitlan, long obscured by colonial and modern construction, emerged through alignments, temple foundations, canal traces, street orientations that followed ancient patterns. The city had been rebuilt, but it had not been remapped. The past was not beneath the present, it was inside it. Modern Mexico inherited this layered reality. In the 19th century, as nationalist movements sought historical legitimacy, the Aztec past became a source of identity. Moctezuma, once viewed as a tragic figure, was reframed as a sovereign. Cuauhtémoc, tortured and executed, became a symbol of resistance. Statues were raised in their honor. Streets were renamed. Schoolbooks recast the conquest not as salvation, but as catastrophe. The ruins of Tenochtitlan, once buried, were excavated, conserved, and framed in museums not as curiosities, but as evidence of civilization. And yet, even in modern commemoration, the complexity of the Mexica legacy remains. Their empire was hierarchical, violent, and built on sacrifice. Their theology was exacting, their politics rigid, but they built one of the most sophisticated urban, ceremonial, and philosophical systems in the pre-modern world. Their calendar rivaled that of any society in Eurasia. Their records of tribute and land use display administrative rigor. Their cosmology, though alien to modern secular sensibilities, offered a coherent explanation of time, nature, and duty. To remember the Aztecs is not to romanticize them. It is to reckon with a world that made sense on its own terms. The rediscovery of the Aztec world was not a single event, but a slow, layered process driven by scholarship, nationalism, and excavation. During the Porfiriato in the late 19th century, Mexican intellectuals began to frame the Mexica past as foundational, not as a pagan aberration, but as the root of Mexican civilization. Neoclassical monuments, murals, and textbooks reimagined Tenochtitlan not as the site of tragic downfall, but as the cradle of indigenous genius, a city that once rivaled the greatest in the world, and that, through conquest, gave rise to the modern Mexican state. The trauma of collapse was repurposed as narrative of synthesis. In the 20th century, this impulse accelerated. Diego Rivera's murals in the Palacio Nacional depicted bustling Aztec markets, imperial councils, and ritual scenes with vibrancy and scale, bringing the past into public view with ideological force. Excavations in the heart of Mexico City uncovered buried offerings, temple foundations, and the great monolith of Coyolxauhqui, a carved record of myth and power long entombed beneath colonial foundations. These findings did more than recover artifacts. They recovered a worldview preserved in stone, waiting to reassert its presence. The Templo Mayor, long thought obliterated, was revealed to lie beneath the city's streets. In the 1970s and 1980s, systematic excavation exposed its core. Stacked platforms, carved altars, caches of ritual objects arranged in symbolic sequence. The deeper archaeologists dug, the more they uncovered not just a building, but a logic, a way of mapping time, cosmos, and obligation into physical space. Sea creatures from both coasts were found in offering pits. Firestones and effigies of rain gods appeared side by side. The temple was a map of empire, a vertical codex of cosmic geography. Today, visitors walk between colonial buildings and glass museums, past ruins exposed beside cathedrals, their eyes moving between centuries. Guides speak of gods and emperors. Schoolchildren recite the tale of the eagle on the cactus. The city once destroyed by fire and steel is now studied, restored, and reimagined. But even as museums and memorials frame the Aztec past in terms of achievement and artistry, a deeper resonance persists, one born of loss, of complexity, and of unresolvable contradiction. The Aztecs were engineers and theologians, poets and imperial administrators, astronomers and warriors. They governed through awe and enforced order through sacrifice. They built a city in water and filled it with stone. Their memory survives not because it flatters the present, but because it resists simplification. To look upon their legacy is to confront a civilization that built its world not with illusions, but with structure, one calibrated to rhythms we have only begun to understand. In the end, the Aztec afterlife is not a question of myth or nostalgia. It is a condition of continuity stratified beneath streets, embedded in speech, encoded in national identity. The fifth sun may have set, but its light remains in fragments, in stone glyphs, in rituals transformed, in the knowledge that great civilizations do not vanish. They sediment, they shift, they wait.